Section 26 of the Ways of the Hour. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ways of the Hour by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 26. I've not wronged her. Far be it from my fears. Then why this argument? My lord, my nature's jealous, and you'll bear it. Otway. So great was the confidence of Sarah Wilmeter and Anna Updike in the innocence of their friend that almost every step that the trial advanced appeared to them as so much progress towards an eventual acquittal. It was perhaps a little singular that the party most interested, she who knew her own guilt or innocence, became dejected, and for the first half hour after they had left the courtroom, she was silent and thoughtful. Good Mrs. Gott was quite in despair, and detained Anna Updike, with whom she had established a sort of intimacy, as she opened the door of the gallery for the admission of the party, in order to say a word on the subject that lay nearest to her heart. "Oh, Miss Anna," said the sheriff's wife, "it goes from bad to worse. It was bad enough last evening, and it is worse tonight." "Who tells you this, Mrs. Gott? So far from thinking as you do, I regard it as appearing particularly favorable. You must have heard what Burton said, and what his wife said, too. They are the witnesses I dread." "Yes, but who will mind what such persons say? I am sure if 50 Mr. and Mrs. Burtons were to testify that Mary Monson had taken money that did not belong to her, I should not believe them." "You are not a Duke's County jury. Why, Miss Anna, these men will believe almost anything you tell them. Only swear to it, and there's no accounting for their credulity. No, I no more believe in Mary Monson's guilt than I do in my own. But law is law, they say, and rich and poor must abide by it. You view the matter under a false light, my kind-hearted Mrs. Gott, and after a night's rest will see the case differently. Sarah and I have been delighted with the course of things. You must have remarked no one said that Mary Monson had been seen to set fire to the house, or to harm the Goodwins, or to touch their property, or to do anything that was wrong, and of course she must be acquitted. I wish that piece of gold had not been found in her pocket. It's that which makes all the trouble. I think nothing of that, my good friend. There is nothing remarkable in 2 pieces of money having the same marks on them. I have seen that often, myself. Besides, Mary Monson explains all that, and her declaration is as good as that of this Miss Burton's any day." "Not in law, Miss Anna. No, not in law. Out of doors it might be much better, and probably is, but not in court, by what they tell me. Gott says it is beginning to look very dark, and that we, in the jail here, must prepare for the very worst. I tell him, if I was he, I'd resign before I'd execute such a beautiful creature." "You make me shudder with such hard thoughts, Mrs. Gott, and I will thank you to open the door. Take courage. We shall never have to lament such a catastrophe, or your husband to perform so revolting a duty." "I hope not. I'm sure I hope not, with all my heart. I would prefer that Gott should give up all hopes of ever rising any higher than have him do this office. One never knows, Miss Anna, what is to happen in life, though I was as happy as a child when he was made sheriff. If my words have any weight with him, and he often says they have, I shall never let him execute Mary Monson. You are young, Miss Anna, but you've heard the tongue of flattery, I make no doubt, and know how sweet it is to woman's ear." Mrs. Gott had been wiping her eyes with one hand and putting the key into the lock with the other, while talking, and she now stood regarding her young companion with a sort of motherly interest, as she made this appeal to her experience. Anna blushed rosy red, and raised her gloved hand to turn the key, as if desirous of getting away from the earnest look of the matron. "That's just the way with all of us, Miss Anna," continued Mrs. Gott. "We listen and listen and listen, and believe and believe and believe, until we are no longer the gay, light-hearted creatures that we were, but become mopey and sighful and anxious, to a degree that makes us forget father and mother and fly from the paternal roof. "Will you have the kindness now to let me into the jail?" said Anna in the gentlest voice imaginable. "In a minute, my dear. I call you my dear because I like you, for I never use what Gott calls high-flown. There is Mr. John Wilmeter, now as handsome and agreeable a youth as ever came to Bibbury. He comes here 2 or 3 times a day, and sits and talks with me in the most agreeable way, until I've got to like him better than any young man of my acquaintance. He talks of you quite half the time, and when he is not talking of you, he is thinking of you, as I know by the way he gazes at this very door." "Perhaps his thoughts are on Mary Monson," answered Anna, blushing scarlet. "You know she is a sort of client of his, and he has been here in her service for a good while. She hardly ever saw him, scarcely ever, except at this grate. His foot never crossed this threshold until his uncle came, and since, I believe he has gone in but once. Mary Monson is not the being he worships. I trust he worships the being we all worship, Mrs. Gott," struggling gently to turn the key and succeeding. "It is not for us poor frail beings to talk of being worshipped." "Or of worshipping, as I tell Gott," said the sheriff's wife, permitting her companion to depart. Anna found Mary Monson and Sarah walking together in the gallery, conversing earnestly. "It is singular that nothing reaches us from Michael Millington," exclaimed the last, as Anna interlocked arms with her and joined the party. "It is now near 48 hours since my uncle sent him to town." "On my business?" demanded Mary Monson quickly. "Certainly, on no other, though what it was that took him away so suddenly I have not been told. I trust you will be able to overturn all that these Burtons have said, and to repair the mischief they have done?" "Fear nothing for me, Miss Wilmeter," answered the prisoner, with singular steadiness of manner. "I tell you, as I have often told your friend, I must be acquitted. Let justice take its course, say I, and the guilty be punished. I have a clue to the whole story, as I believe, and must make provision for tomorrow. Do you two, dear warm-hearted friends as you are, now leave me, and when you reach the inn, send Mr. Dunscombe hither as soon as possible. Not that Tim's, but noble, honest, upright Mr. Dunscombe. Kiss me, each of you, and so good night. Think of me in your prayers. I am a great sinner, and have need of your prayers." The wishes of Mary Monson were obeyed, and the young ladies left the jail for the night. 10 minutes later, Dunscombe reached the place and was admitted. His conference with his client was long, intensely interesting, and it quite unsettled the notions he had had now, for some time, entertained of her guilt. She did not communicate anything concerning her past life, nor did she make any promises on that subject, but she did communicate facts of great importance, as connected with the result of her trial. Dunscombe left her, at a late hour, with views entirely changed, hopes revived, and his resolution stimulated. He made ample entries in his brief, nor did he lay his head on his pillow until it was very late. The little court-house bell rang as usual. Next morning, and judge, jurors, witnesses, lawyers, and the curious in general, collected as before, without any ceremony, though in decent quiet. The case was now getting to be so serious that all approached it as truly a matter of life and death, even the reporters submitting to an impulse of humanity, and viewing the whole affair less in a business point of view than as one which might carry a singularly gifted woman into the other world. The first act of the day opened by putting Mrs. Burton on the stand for her cross-examination, as every intelligent person present understood that on her testimony depended the main result. The fall of a pin might almost have been heard, so profound was the general wish to catch what was going on. The witness, however, appeared to be calm, while the advocate was pale and anxious. He had the air of one who had slept little the past night. He arranged his papers with studied care, made each movement deliberately, compressed his lips, and seemed to be bringing his thoughts into such a state of order and distinctness that each might be resorted to as it was needful. In point of fact, Dunscombe foresaw that a human life depended very much on the result of this cross-examination, and like a conscientious man, he was disposed to do his whole duty. No wonder, then, that he paused to reflect, was deliberate in his acts, and concentrated in feeling. "We will first give our attention to this piece of gold, Mrs. Burton," the counsel for the prisoner mildly commenced, motioning to the coroner, who was in court, to show the witness the piece of money so often examined. "Are you quite certain that it is the very coin that you saw in the possession of Mrs. Goodwin?" "Absolutely certain, sir. As certain as I am of anything in the world." "Mrs. Burton, I wish you to remember that the life of the prisoner at the bar will, most probably, be affected by your testimony. Be kind enough, then, to be very guarded and close in your answers. Do you still say that this is the precise coin that you once saw in Mrs. Goodwin's stocking?" The witness seemed suddenly struck with the manner of the advocate. She trembled from head to foot. Still, Dunscombe spoke mildly, kindly even, and the idea conveyed in the present was but a repetition of that conveyed in the former question. Nevertheless, those secret agencies, by means of which thought meets thought, unknown to all but their possessors, that set in motion, as it might be, all the covert currents of the mind, causing them to flow towards similar streams in the mind of another, were now at work, and Dunscombe and the witness had a clue to each other's meaning that entirely escaped the observation of all around them. There is nothing novel in this state of secret intelligence. It doubtless depends on a mutual consciousness and a common knowledge of certain material facts, the latter being applied by the former, with promptitude and tact. Notwithstanding her sudden alarm and the change it brought over her entire manner, Mrs. Burton answered the question as before. What was more, she answered it truly. The piece of gold found in Mary Monson's purse, and now in possession of the coroner, who had kept it carefully in order to identify it, had been in Dorothy Goodwin's stocking. "Quite certain, sir. I know that to be the same piece of money that I saw, at different times, in Mrs. Goodwin's stocking. Did you ever have that gold coin in your own hand, Mrs. Burton, previously to this trial?" This was a very natural and simple interrogatory, one that might be, and probably was, anticipated. Yet it gave the witness uneasiness, more from the manner of Dunscombe, perhaps, than from anything in the nature of the inquiry itself. The answer, however, was given promptly, and, as before, with perfect truth. "On several occasions, sir, I saw that notch, and talked with Mrs. Goodwin about it more than once." "What was the substance of Mrs. Goodwin's remarks in relation to that notch?" "She asked me one time if I thought it lessened the weight of the coin, and if so, how much I thought it might take away from its value." "What was your answer?" "I believe I said I did not think it could make any great difference." "Did Mrs. Goodwin ever tell you how or where she got that piece of money?" "Yes, sir, she did. She told me it came from Mary Monson." "In pay for board, or for what purpose did it pass from one to the other?" This, too, was a very simple question, but the witness no longer answered promptly. The reader will remember that Mary Monson had said, before the coroner, that she had 2 of these coins, and that she had given one of them to the poor unfortunate deceased, and had left the other in her own purse. This answer had injured the cause of the accused, inasmuch as it was very easy to tell such a tale, while few in Bibbery were disposed to believe that gold passed thus freely, and without any consideration, from hand to hand. Mrs. Burton remembered all this, and, for a reason best known to herself, she shrunk a little from making the required reply. Still, she did answer this question also, and answered it truly. "I understood Aunt Dolly to say that Mary Monson made her a present of that piece of money." Here Timms elevated his nose and looked around him in a meaning manner that appealed to the audience to know if his client were not a person of veracity. Sooth to say, this answer made a strong impression in favor of the accused, and Dunscombe saw with satisfaction that, insomuch he had materially gained ground. He was not a man to gain it, however, by dramatic airs. He merely paused for a few moments in order to give full effect to this advantage. Mrs. Goodwin, then, owned to you that she had the coin from Mary Monson, and that it was a present, was the next question. She did, sir. Did she say anything about Mary Monson's having another piece of money, like the one before you, and which was given by her to Dorothy Goodwin? A long pause succeeded. The witness raised a hand to her brow and appeared to meditate. Her reputation for taciturnity and gravity of deportment was such that most of those in court believed she was endeavoring to recollect the past, in order to say neither more nor less than the truth. In point of fact, she was weighing well the effect of her words, for she was a person of extreme caution, and of great reputed probity of character. The reply came at length. She did speak on the subject, she said, and did state something of the kind. Can you recollect her words? If so, give them to the jury. If not her very words, their substance. Aunt Dolly had a way of her own in talking, which makes it very difficult to repeat her precise words. But she said, in substance, that Mary Monson had 2 of these pieces of money, one of which was given to her. Mary Monson, then, kept the other? So I understood it, sir. Have you any knowledge yourself on this subject? If so, state it to the jury. Another pause, one even longer than before, and again the hand was raised to the brow. The witness now spoke with extreme caution, seeming to feel her way among the facts, as a cat steals on its prey. I believe I have I've seen Mary Monson's purse, and I believe I saw a piece of money in it which resembled this. Are you not certain of the fact? Perhaps I am. Here Dunscombe's face was lighted with a smile. He evidently was encouraged. Were you present, Mrs. Burton, when Mary Monson's purse was examined in presence of the inquest? I was. Did you then see its contents? I did. After the longest pause of all. Had you that purse in your hand, ma'am? The brow was once more shaded, and the recollection seemingly taxed. I think I had. It was passed round among us, and I believe that I touched it, as well as others. Are you not certain that you did so? Yes, sir. Now I reflect. I know that I did. The piece of money found in Mary Monson's purse was passed from one to another, and to me among the rest. This was very wrong, observed His Honor. It was wrong, sir, but not half as wrong as the murders and arson, coolly remarked Williams. Go on, gentlemen. Time is precious. Now, Mrs. Burton, I wish to ask you a very particular question, and I beg that your answer may be distinct and guarded. Did you ever have access to the piece of gold found, or said to be found, in Mary Monson's purse, except on the occasion of the inquest? The longest pause of all, and the deepest shading of the brow. So long was the self-deliberation this time as to excite a little remark among the spectators. Still, it was no more than prudent to be cautious in a cause of so much importance. I certainly have, sir, was the reply that came at last. I saw it in Dorothy Goodwin's stocking several times, had it in my hand and examined it. This is the way I came to discover the notch. Aunt Dolly and I talked about that notch, as I have already told the court. Quite true, ma'am. We remember that. All your answers are carefully written out. I'm sure nothing that I've said can be written out which is not true, sir. We are to suppose that. And now, ma'am, permit me to ask if you ever saw that piece of money at any other time than at those you have mentioned. Be particular in the answer. I may, after a long pause. Do you not know? I do not, sir. Will you say on your oath that you cannot recollect any one occasion, other than those you have mentioned, on which you have seen and handled that piece of money? When Aunt Dolly showed it to me, before the coroner and here in court, I recollect no other time. Let me put this question to you again, Mrs. Burton, recalling the solemnity of the oath you have taken. Have you, or have you not, seen that piece of money on any other occasion than those you have just mentioned? I do not remember ever to have seen it at any other time, answered the woman firmly. Mary Monson gave a little start, and Dunscombe appeared disappointed. Timms bit his lip and looked anxiously at the jury, while Williams once more cocked his nose and looked around him in triumph. If the witness spoke the truth, she was now likely to adhere to it. If, on the other hand, there were really any ground for Dunscombe's question, the witness had passed the Rubicon, and would adhere to her falsehood even more tenaciously than she would adhere to the truth. The remainder of this cross-examination was of very little importance. Nothing further was obtained from the witness that went to shake her testimony. Our limits will not permit a detailed account of all the evidence that was given in behalf of the prosecution. All that appeared before the inquest was now introduced, methodized, and arranged by Williams, processes that rendered it much more respectable than it had originally appeared to be. At length it came to the turn of the defense to open. This was a task that Dunscombe took on himself, Timms, in his judgment, being unequal to it. His opening was very effective in the way of argument, though necessarily not conclusive, the case not making in favor of his client. The public expected important revelations as to the past history of the prisoner, and of this Timms had apprised Dunscombe. The latter, however, was not prepared to make them. Mary Monson maintained all her reserve, and Millington did not return. The cause was now so far advanced as to render it improbable that any facts of this nature could be obtained in sufficient season to be used, and the counsel saw the necessity of giving a new turn to this particular point in the case. He consequently complained that the prosecution had neglected to show anything in the past life of the accused to render it probable she had been guilty of the offenses with which she was charged. Mary Monson appears here, he went on to say, with a character as fair as that of any other female in the community. This is the presumption of law, and you will truly regard her, gentlemen, as one that is innocent until she is proved to be guilty. The inference drawn from the silence of the prosecution was not strictly logical, perhaps, but Dunscombe managed at least to mystify the matter in such a way as to prepare the jury to hear a defense that would be silent on this head, and to leave a doubt whether this silence was not solely the fault of the counsel for the prosecution. While he was commenting on this branch of the subject, Williams took notes furiously, and Timms foresaw that he meant to turn the tables on them at the proper moment. Pretty much as a matter of course, Dunscombe was compelled to tell the court and jury that the defense relied principally on the insufficiency of the evidence of the other side. This was altogether circumstantial, and the circumstances, as he hoped to be able to convince the jury, were of a nature that admitted of more than one construction. Whenever this was the case, it was the duty of the jury to give the accused the full benefit of these doubts. The rest of the opening had the usual character of appeals to the sympathy and justice of the jury, very prudently and properly put. Dr. McBrain was now placed upon the stand, when the customary questions were asked to show that he was a witness entitled to the respect of the court. He was then further interrogated, as follows. Have you seen the two skeletons that are now in court, and which are said to have been taken from the ruins of the House of the Goodwins? I have. I saw them before the inquest, and I have again examined them here in court. What do you say as to their sex? I believe them both to be the skeletons of females. Do you feel certain of this fact? Reasonably so, but not absolutely. No one can pronounce with perfect certainty in such a case, more especially when the remains are in the state in which these have been found. We are guided principally by the comparative size of the bones, and, as these are affected by the age of the subject, it is hazardous to be positive. I can only say that I think both of these skeletons belong to female subjects, particularly the shortest. Have you measured the skeletons? I have, and find one rather more than 1.5 inches shorter than the other. The longest measures quite 5 feet 7.5 in the state in which it is, while the shortest measures a trifle less than 5 feet 6. If women, both were of unusual stature, particularly the first. I think that the bones of both indicate that they belong to females, and I should have thought the same had I known nothing of the reports which have reached my ears touching the persons whose remains these are said to be. When you first formed your opinion of the sex of those to whom these remains belonged, had you heard that there was a German woman staying in the house of the Goodwins at the time of the fire? I think not, though I have taken so little heed of these rumors as to be uncertain when I first heard this circumstance. I do remember, however, that I was under the impression the remains were, beyond a doubt, those of Peter Goodwin and his wife. When I commenced the examination of them, and I very distinctly recollect the surprise I felt when the conviction crossed my mind that both were the skeletons of women. From the nature of this feeling, I rather think I could not have heard anything of the German female at that time. The cross-examination of Dr. McBrane was very long and searching, but it did not materially affect the substance of his testimony. On the contrary, it rather strengthened it, since he had it in his power to explain himself more fully under the interrogatories of Williams than he could do in an examination in chief. Still, he could go no farther than give his strong belief, declining to pronounce positively on the sex of either individual in the state in which the remains were found. Although nothing positive was obtained from this testimony, the minds of the jurors were pointedly directed to the circumstance of the sudden and unexplained disappearance of the German woman, thus making an opening for the admission of a serious doubt connected with the fate of that person. It was a sad thing to reflect that, beyond this testimony of McBrane, there was little other direct evidence to offer in behalf of the accused. It is true the insufficiency of that which had been produced by the prosecution might avail her much, and on this Dunscombe saw that his hopes of an acquittal must depend, but he could not refrain from regretting, and that bitterly, that the unmoved resolution of his client not to let her past life be known must so much weaken his case, were she innocent, and so much fortify that of the prosecution, under the contrary supposition. Another physician or two were examined to sustain McBrane, but, after all, the condition of the remains was such as to render any testimony questionable. One witness went so far as to say, it is true, that he thought he could distinguish certain unerring signs of the sex in the length of the lower limbs, and another similar proof, but even McBrane was forced to admit that such distinctions were very vague and unsatisfactory. His own opinion was formed more from the size of the bones, generally, than from any other proof. In general, there was little difficulty in speaking of the sex of the subject, when the skeleton was entire and well preserved, and particularly when the teeth furnished some clue to the age, but, in this particular case, as has already been stated, there could be no such thing as absolute certainty. It was with a heavy heart, and with many an anxious glance cast towards the door, in the hope of seeing Michael Millington enter, that Dunscombe admitted the prisoner had no further testimony to offer. He had spun out the little he did possess, in order to give it an appearance of importance which it did not actually bring with it, and to divert the minds of the jurors from the impression they had probably obtained of the remains necessarily being those of Goodwin and his wife. The summing up on both sides was a grave and solemn scene. Here Williams was thrown out, the district attorney choosing to perform his own duty on an occasion so serious. Dunscombe made a noble appeal to the justice of the court and jury, admonishing both of the danger of yielding too easily to circumstantial evidence. It was the best possible proof, he admitted, when the circumstances were sufficiently clear and sufficiently shown to be themselves beyond controversy. That Mary Monson dwelt with the Goodwins, was in the house at the time of the arson and murder, if such crimes were ever committed at all, that she escaped and all her property was saved, would of themselves amount to nothing. The testimony, indeed, on several of these heads rather told in her favor than the reverse. The witnesses for the prosecution proved that she was in her room, beneath the roof, when the flames broke out, and was saved with difficulty. This was a most material fact, and Dunscombe turned it to good account. Would an incendiary be apt to place herself in a situation in which her own life was in danger? And this, too, under circumstances that rendered no such measure necessary? Then, all the facts connected with Mary Monson's residence and habits told in her favor. Why should she remain so long at the cottage if robbery was her only purpose? The idea of her belonging to a gang that had sent her to make discoveries and to execute its plans was preposterous, for what hindered any of the men of that gang from committing the crimes in the most direct manner, and with the least loss of time? No, if Mary Monson were guilty, she was undoubtedly guilty on her own account, and had been acting with the uncertain aim and hand of a woman. The jury must discard all notions of accomplices, and consider the testimony solely in connection with the acts of the accused. Accomplices, and those of the nature supposed, would have greatly simplified the whole of the wretched transaction. They would have rendered both the murders and arson unnecessary. The bold and strong do not commit these crimes, except in those cases in which resistance renders them necessary. Here was clearly no resistance, as was shown by the quiet positions in which the skeletons had been found. If a murder was directly committed, it must have been by the blow on the heads, and the jury was asked to consider whether a delicate female like Mary Monson had even the physical force necessary to strike such a blow. With what instrument was it done? Nothing of the sort was found near the bodies, and no proof of any such blow was before the jury. One witness had said that the ironwork of a plough lay quite near the remains, and it had been shown that Peter Goodwin kept such articles in a loft over his bedroom. He would suggest the possibility of the fires having commenced in that loft, through which the pipe of a cooking stove led, of its having consumed the beams of the floor, letting down this plough and share upon the heads of the sleeping couple below, stunning, if not killing them, thus leaving them unresisting subjects to the action of the element. McBrain had been examined on this point, which we omitted to state in its place, to prevent repetition. He and the other two doctors brought forward for the defense had tried to place the plowshare on the skulls, and were of opinion that the injuries might have been inflicted by that piece of iron. But Mary Monson could not use such an instrument. This was beyond all dispute. If the plowshare inflicted the blow, and the testimony on this point was at least entitled to respect, then was Mary Monson innocent of any murder committed by direct means? It is true, she was responsible for all her acts, and if she set fire to the building, she was probably guilty of murder as well as of arson. But would she have done this and made no provision for her own escape? The evidence was clear that she was rescued by means of a ladder and through a window, and that there were no other means of escape. Dunscombe reasoned on these several points with great force and ingenuity. So clear were his statements, so logical his inferences, and so candid his mode of arguing, that he had produced a great effect ere he closed this branch of his subject. It is true that one far more difficult remained to be met, to answer which he now set about with fear and trembling. We allude to the piece of money alleged to have been found in Mary Monson's purse. Dunscombe had very little difficulty in disposing of the flippant widow Pope, but the Burton family gave him more trouble. Nevertheless, it was his duty to endeavor to get rid of them, or at least so far to weaken their testimony as to give his client the benefit of the doubt. There was, in truth, but one mode of doing this. It was to impress on the jury the probability that the coin had been changed in passing from hand to hand. It is true, it was not easy to suggest any plausible reason why such an act of treachery should have been committed, but it was a good legal point to show that this piece of money had not, at all times, been absolutely under the eye or within the control of the coroner. If there were a possibility of a change, the fact should and ought to tell in favor of his client. Mrs. Burton had made admissions on this point which entitled the prisoner to press the facts on the minds of the jurors, and her counsel did not fail so to do, with clearness and energy. After all, this was much the most difficult point of the case, and it would not admit of a perfectly satisfactory solution. The conclusion of Dunscombe's summing up was manly, touching, even eloquent. He spoke of a lone and defenseless female, surrounded by strangers, being dragged to the bar in charges of such gravity, pointed to his client where she sat enthralled by his language, with all the signs of polished refinement on her dress, person, and manners, delicate, feminine, and beautiful, and asked if anyone, who had the soul and feelings of a man, could believe that such a being had committed the crimes imputed to Mary Monson. The appeal was powerful, and was dwelt on just long enough to give it full and fair effect. It left the bench, the bar, the jury box, the whole audience, in fact, in tears. The prisoner alone kept an unmoistened eye, but it was in a face flushed with feeling. Her self-command was almost supernatural. End of chapter 26. Read by Nick Autorina. Woodstock, Georgia, June 14th, 2026. Section 27 of The Ways of the Hour. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ways of the Hour by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 27. I'll brave her to her face. I'll give my anger its free course against her. Thou shalt see, Phoenix, how I'll break her pride. The Distressed Mother. The district attorney was fully impressed with the importance of the duty that had now devolved on him. Although we have daily proofs on all sides of us of the truth of that remark of Bacon's, that no man rises to eminence in the state without a mixture of great and mean qualities, this favorite of the people had his good points as well as another. He was a humane man, and, contrary to the expectations, and greatly to the disappointment of Williams, he now took on himself the office of summing up. The public functionary commenced in a mild, quiet manner, manifesting by the key on which he pitched his voice a natural reluctance to his painful duty. But he was steady and collected. He opened with a brief summary of the facts. A strange female, of high personal pretensions, had taken lodgings in an humble dwelling. That dwelling contained a considerable sum of money. Some counted it by thousands, all by hundreds. In either case, it was a temptation to the covetous and ill-disposed. The lodgings were unsuited to the habits of the guest, but she endured them for several weeks. A fire occurred, and the house was consumed. The remains of the husband and wife were found, as the jury saw them, with marks of violence on their skulls. A deadly blow had been struck by someone. The bureau containing the money was found locked, but the money itself was missing. One piece of that money was known, and it was traced to the purse of the female lodger. This stranger was arrested, and, in her mode of living in the jail, in her expenditures of every sort, she exhibited the habits and profusion of one possessed of considerable sums. Doubtless many of the reports in circulation were false. Exaggerations ever accompanied each statement of any unusual occurrence, but enough was proved to show that Mary Monson had a considerable amount of money at command. Whence came these funds? That which was lightly obtained went lightly. The jury were exhorted to reject every influence but that which was sustained by the evidence. All that had been here stated rested on uncontradicted, unresisted testimony. There was no desire to weaken the force of the defense. This defense had been ingeniously and powerfully presented, and to what did it amount? The direct, unequivocal evidence of Mrs. Burton as to her knowledge of the piece of money and all that related to it, and this evidence sustained by so much that was known to others, the coroner included, was met by a conjecture. This conjecture was accompanied by an insinuation that some might suppose reflected on the principal witness, but it was only an insinuation. There were two legal modes of attacking the credibility of a witness. One was by showing habitual mendacity, the other by demonstrating from the evidence itself that the testimony could not be true. Had either been done in the present instance? The district attorney thought not. One, and this the most common course, had not even been attempted. Insinuations rather than just deductions, he was compelled to say, notwithstanding his high respect for the learned counsel opposed to him, had been the course adopted. That counsel had contended that the circumstances were not sufficient to justify a verdict of guilty. Of this, the jury were the sole judges. If they believed Mrs. Burton, sustained as she was by so much other testimony, they must admit that Dorothy Goodwin's money was found in Mary Monson's purse. This was the turning point of the case. All depended on the construction of this one fact. He left it to the jury, to their good sense, to their consciences. On the part of the defense, great stress had been laid on the circumstance that Mary Monson was herself rescued from the flames with some difficulty. But for assistance, she would most probably have perished. The district attorney desired to deny nothing that could justly go to prove the prisoner's innocence. The fact was unquestionably as stated. But for assistance, Mary Monson might have perished. But assistance was not wanting, for strangers were most opportunely at hand, and they did this piece of good service. They remained until all was over, and vanished. No one knew them, whence they came or whither they went. Important agents in saving a life, they had gone without their reward, and were not even named in the newspaper accounts of the occurrence. Reporters generally tell more than happens. In this instance, they were mute. As for the danger of the prisoner, it might have happened in a variety of ways that affected neither her guilt nor her innocence. After committing the murders, she may have gone into her room and been unexpectedly enclosed by the flames, or the whole may have been previously planned, in order to give her the plea of this very dangerous situation as a proof of innocence. Such immaterial circumstances were not to overshadow the very material facts on which the prosecution rested. Another important question was to be asked by the jury. If Mary Monson did not commit these crimes, who did? It had been suggested that the house might have taken fire by accident, and that the plowshare was the real cause of the death of its owners. If this were so, did the plowshare remove the money? Did the plowshare put the notched piece in Mary Monson's purse? Such is an outline of the manner in which the district attorney reasoned on the facts. His summing up made a deep impression. The moderation of the manner in which he pressed the guilt of the accused, telling strongly against her. Nothing was said of aristocracy, or harps, or manners, or of anything else that did not fairly belong to the subject. A great deal more was said, of course, but we do not conceive it necessary to advert to it. The charge was exceedingly impartial. The judge made a full exposition of all the testimony, pointed out its legitimate bearing, and dissected its weak points. As for the opinion of McBrain and his associates, the court conceived it entitled to a great deal of consideration. Here were several highly respectable professional men testifying that, in their judgment, both the skeletons were those of females. The German woman was missing. What had become of her? In any case, the disappearance of that woman was very important. She may have committed the crimes and absconded, or one of the skeletons may have been hers. It was in evidence that Peter Goodwin and his wife did not live always in the most happy mood, and he may have laid hands on the money, which was probably his in the eyes of the law, and left the place. He had not been seen since the fire. The jury must take all the facts into their consideration and decide according to their consciences. This charge was deemed rather favorable to the accused than otherwise. The humanity of the judge was conspicuous throughout, and he leaned quite obviously to Dunscombe's manner of treating the danger of Mary Monson from the flames, and dwelt on the fact that the piece of money was not sufficiently watched to make out an absolute case of identity. When he had done, the impression was very general that the prisoner would be acquitted. As it was reasonably supposed that a case of this importance would detain the jury a considerable time, the court permitted the prisoner to withdraw. She left the place, attended by her two friends, the latter in tears, while Mary herself was still seemingly unmoved. The thoughtful Mrs. Gott had prepared refreshments for her, and, for the first time since her trial commenced, the fair prisoner ate heartily. "I shall owe my triumph not to money, my dear girls," she said while at table, "not to friends nor to a great array of counsel, but to truth. I did not commit these crimes, and on the testimony of the state alone, with scarcely any of my own, the jury will have to say as much. No stain will rest on my character, and I can meet my friends with the unclouded brow of innocence. This is a very precious moment to me. I would not part with it for all the honors that riches and rank can bestow." "How strange that you of all women, my dear mamma," said Anna, kissing her cheek, "should be accused of crimes so horrible to obtain a little money. For this poor Mrs. Goodwin could have had no great sum after all, and you are so rich." "More is the pity that I have not made a better use of my money. You are to be envied, girls, in having the fortunes of gentlewomen, and in having no more. I do believe it is better for our sex barely to be independent in their respective stations, and not to be rendered rich. Man or woman, money is a dangerous thing, when we come to consider it as a part of our natural existence, for it tempts us to fancy that money's worth gives rights that nature and reason both deny. I believe I should have been much happier, were I much poorer than I am." "But those who are rich are not very likely to rob." "Certainly not, in the sense that you mean, my dear. Send Marie Moulin on some errand, Anna. I wish to tell you and Sarah what I think of this fire, and of the deaths for which I am now on trial." Anna complied, and the handsome prisoner, first looking cautiously around to make certain she was not overheard, proceeded with her opinion. "In the first place, I make no doubt Dr. McBrain is right, and that both the skeletons are those of women. The German woman got to be very intimate with Mrs. Goodwin, and as the latter and her husband quarreled daily and fiercely, I think it probable that she took this woman into her bed, where they perished together. I should think the fire purely accidental, were it not for the missing stocking." "That is just what the district attorney said," cried Anna innocently. "Who, then, can have set the house on fire?" Mary Monson muttered to herself, and she smiled as if some queer fancies crowded her brain. But no one was the wiser for her ruminations. These she kept to herself, and continued. "Yes, that missing stocking renders the arson probable. The question is, who did the deed? I or Mrs. Burton?" "Mrs. Burton!" exclaimed both the girls in a breath. "Why, her character is excellent. No one has ever suspected her. You cannot suppose that she is the guilty person. It is she, or it is I, which I will leave you to judge. I was aware that the notch was in the coin, for I was about to give the other piece to Mrs. Goodwin, but preferred to keep the perfect specimen myself. The notched piece must have been in the stocking until after the fire, and it was changed by someone while my purse was under examination." "And you suppose that Mrs. Burton did it?" "I confess to a suspicion to that effect. Who else could or would have done it? I have mentioned this distrust to Mr. Dunscombe, and he cross-examined in reference to this fact, though nothing very satisfactory was extracted. After my acquittal, steps will be taken to push the inquiry further." Mary Monson continued discussing this subject for quite an hour, her wondering companions putting questions. At the end of that time, Mr. Gott appeared to say that the jury had come into court, and that it was his duty to take the prisoner there to meet them. Perhaps Mary Monson never looked more lovely than at that moment. She had dressed herself with great simplicity, but with exceeding care. Excitement gave her the richest color. Hope, even delight, was glowing in her eyes, and her whole form was expanding with the sentiment of triumph. There is no feeling more general than sympathy with success. After the judge's charge, few doubted of the result, and on every side, as she walked with a light, firm step to her chair, the prisoner read kindness, sympathy, and exultation. After all that had been said, and all the prejudices that had been awakened, Mary Monson was about to be acquitted. Even the reporters became a little humanized, had juster perceptions than common of the rights of their fellow creatures, and a more smiling, benignant assembly was never collected in that hall. In a few minutes, silence was obtained, and the jurors were called. Every man answered to his name, when the profound stillness of expectation pervaded the place. "Stand up, Mary Monson, and listen to the verdict," said the clerk, not without a little tremor in his voice. "Gentlemen, what do you say? Is the prisoner guilty or not guilty?" The foreman arose, stroked down a few scattering gray hairs, then, in a voice barely audible, he pronounced the portentous word, "Guilty." Had a bomb suddenly exploded in the room, it could not have produced a greater astonishment and scarcely more consternation. Anna Updike darted forward, and, as with a single bound, Mary Monson was folded in her arms. "No, no!" cried this warm-hearted girl, totally unconscious of the impropriety of her acts. "She is not guilty. You do not know her. I do. She was my school mamma. She is a lady, incapable of being guilty of such crimes. No, no, gentlemen, you will think better of this and alter your verdict. Perhaps it was a mistake and you meant to say not guilty." "Who is this young lady?" asked the judge in a tremulous voice. "A relative of the prisoner's?" "No, sir," answered the excited girl. "No relative, but a very close friend. She was my school mamma once, and I know she is not a person to rob and murder and set fire to houses. Her birth, education, character all place her above it. You will think better of this, gentleman, and change your verdict. Now, go at once and do it, or you may distress her." "Does anyone know who this young lady is?" demanded His Honor, his voice growing more and more tremulous. "I am Anna Updike, Dr. McBrain's daughter, now, and Uncle Tom's niece," answered Anna, scarce knowing what she said. "But never mind me. It is Mary Monson here who has been tried, and who has so wrongfully been found guilty. She never committed these crimes. I tell you, sir, is incapable of committing them, had no motive for committing them, and I beg you will put a stop to these proceedings before they get so far as to make it difficult to recede. Just tell the jury to alter their verdict. No, no, Mary Monson is no murderess. She would no more hurt the Goodwins or touch a particle of their gold than either of us all. You do not know her, sir. If you did, you would smile at this mistake of the jury, for it is all a cruel mistake. Now do, my dear sir, send them away again and tell them to be more reasonable." "The young lady had better be removed," interposed the judge, wiping his eyes. "Such scenes may be natural, and the court looks on them leniently. But time is precious, and my duty renders it necessary to interpose my authority to maintain the order of our proceedings. Let some of the ladies remove the young lady. She is too delicate for the touch of a constable, but time is precious." The judge was not precisely conscious, himself, of what he was saying, though he knew the general drift of his remarks. The process of blowing his nose interrupted his speech more than once, and Anna was removed by the assistance of Marie Moulin, Sarah Wilmeter, and good Mrs. Gott, the latter sobbing like a child, while the other two scarce realized the consequences of the momentous word that had just been pronounced. Dunscombe took care that the whole group should quit the building and be removed to the tavern. If the bar and the spectators in general had been surprised at the calmness of exterior maintained by the prisoner previously to the verdict, their wonder was sensibly increased by the manner which succeeded it. Mary Monson's beauty shone with increasing radiance as the justice of her country seemed to threaten her existence more and more, and at the particular moment when she was left alone, by the withdrawal of her female companions, many present fancied that she had increased in stature. Certainly, it was a rare sight to observe the illuminated countenance, the erect mien, and the offended air, with which one of the weaker sex, and one so youthful and charming, met a doom so terrible. Of the jury she took no notice. Her eye was on the judge, who was endeavoring to muster sufficient fortitude to pronounce the final decision of the law. "Before the court pronounces sentence, Mr. Dunscombe," observed that functionary, "it will cheerfully hear anything you may have to offer in behalf of the prisoner, or it will hear the prisoner herself. It is better, on every account, that all my painful duties be discharged at once, in order that the prisoner may turn her attention to the only two sources of mercy that now remain open to her, the earthly and the heavenly. My duty, as you well know, cannot now be avoided, and the sooner it is performed, perhaps the better for all concerned. It shall be my care to see that the condemned has time to make all her appeals, let them be to the authorities here or to the more dreaded power above." "I am taken so much by surprise, Your Honor, at a verdict that, to say the least, is given on very doubtful testimony, that I hardly know what to urge. As the court, however, is disposed to indulgence, and there will be time to look at the law of the case, as well as to address our petitions and affidavits to the authority at Albany, I shall interpose no objection, and, as Your Honor well remarks, since the painful duty must be discharged, it were better, perhaps, that it were discharged now." "Prisoner at the bar," resumed the judge, "you have heard the finding of the jury in your case. A verdict of guilty has been rendered, and it has become my painful duty to pronounce the awful sentence of the law. If you have anything to say previously to this, the last and most painful of all my duties, the court will give your words a kind and lenient hearing." In the midst of a stillness that seemed supernatural, the sweet melodious voice of Mary Monson was heard, first gentle, almost inaudible, but gathering strength as she proceeded, until it became clear, distinct, and silvery. There are a few things that impart a higher charm than the voice, and the extraordinary prisoner possessed an organ which, while it was feminine and sweet, had a depth and richness that at once denoted her power in song. On the present occasion, it was not even tremulous. "I believe I understand you, sir," Mary Monson commenced. "I have been tried and found guilty of having murdered Peter and Dorothy Goodwin, after having robbed them, and then of setting fire to the house." "You have been tried for the murder of Peter Goodwin only, the indictments for the second murder and for the arson not having yet been tried. The court has been obliged to separate the cases, lest the law be defeated on mere technicalities. This verdict renders further proceedings unnecessary, and the two remaining indictments will probably never be traversed." "I believe I still understand you, sir, and I thank you sincerely for the kind manner in which you have communicated these facts, as well as for the consideration and gentleness you have manifested throughout these proceedings. It has been very kind in you, sir, and whatever may come of this, God will remember and reward you for it." "The court will hear you, Mary Monson, if you have anything to say before sentence be passed." "Perhaps I might say and do much to affect your decision, sir," returned the prisoner, leaning her fair brow for a moment on her hand. "But there would be little satisfaction in it. It was my wish to be acquitted on the testimony of the state. I did hope that this jury would not have seen the proofs of guilt in the evidence that has been brought against me, and I confess there would be very little satisfaction to me in any other acquittal. As I understand the case, should I be acquitted as respects Peter Goodwin, I must still be tried as respects his wife, and lastly, for setting fire to the house." "You are not acquitted of the murder of Peter Goodwin," mildly interposed the judge. "The finding of the court has been just to the contrary." "I am aware of this, sir. America has many enemies. I have lived in foreign lands, and know this from near and long observation. There are those, and those, too, who are in power, that would gladly see the great example in prosperity, peace, and order that this country has hitherto given to the world, beaten down by our own vices, and the mistaken uses to which the people put the blessings of divine providence. I do not reverence the justice of my country, as I did. It is impossible that I should do so. I now see plainly that its agents are not all of the character they should be, and that, so far from justice's being blind through her impartiality alone, she is also blind through her ignorance. Why am I found guilty of this act? On what evidence, or even on what probability? The whole of the proof is connected with that piece of money. Mrs. Burton has testified that Mrs. Goodwin herself admitted that I had given her that coin, just what I told the coroner, and which I then saw was not believed, for it has been my misfortune to be tried by strangers. Will these gentlemen ask themselves why I have committed the crime of which they have found me guilty? It could not be for money, as of that I have, of my own, more than I want, more perhaps than it is good for me to be mistress of. Why have not these facts been shown to the jury, at the proper time and in the proper manner if true?" demanded the judge kindly. "They are material, and might have influenced the verdict." The jury was discharged, but not one of them all had left the box. One or two of them now arose, and looks of doubt and indecision began to flicker over their countenances. They had been influenced by one man, a friend and political confidant of William's, who had led the undecided to his own opinions. We do not mean to say that this man was perjured, or that he was himself conscious of the extent of the wrong he was doing, but his mind had been perverted by the serpent-like report, and he had tried the cause under the influence of rumors, which had no foundation in truth. The case was one of honest doubt, as no one will deny, but instead of giving the accused the benefit of this doubt, as by law and in reason he was bound to do, he had taken a bias altogether from outside influences, and that bias he communicated to others, until by the sheer force of numbers, the few who wavered were driven into a corner and soon capitulated. Then there was a morbid satisfaction in the minds of several of the jurors, in running counter to the charge of the judge. This was a species of independence that is grateful to some men, and they are guided by their vanity, when they fancy they are only led by conscience. These malign influences were unknown to themselves, for not one of the 12 was absolutely corrupt, but neither of them all was qualified by nature or education to be a judge, freed from the influence of the bench, in a case affecting a human life. Anyone in the least observant of what is going on around him must have had many opportunities of perceiving how strangely juries render their verdicts, and how much the last appear to be opposed to the inferences of the looker-on, as well as to the expressed opinions of the courts. The falling off in the power of the judges over the minds of the jurors we suppose to be derived from a combination of causes. The tendency of the times is to make men confident in their own judgments, and to defer less than formerly to knowledge and experience. Seeing this very general trait, the judges themselves defer to the tendency, manifest less confidence in their station and knowledge, and perhaps really feel it, while the unceasing cry of the infallibility of the common mind induces the vulgar, or average intellect, to shrink from any collision with that which wears the semblance, even though simulated, of the popular will. In this way is the institution of the jury gradually getting to be perverted, rendering that which is safe as an human tribunal can well be, when under the guidance of the court, as dangerous as ignorance, party, self-will, and obstinacy can well make it. I do not know, resumed Mary Monson, that one is yet obliged in America to lay open her account books and show her rent roll, or her bonds and mortgages, in order to avoid the gallows. I have been told that crime must be brought home by unanswerable proof in order to convict. Who can say that such proof has been adduced in my case? It has not even been made certain that a man was killed at all. Most respectable witnesses have testified that they believe those revolting remains of poor humanity belonged once to women. Nor has it been shown that any one has been murdered. The fire may have been accidental, the deaths a simple consequence of the fire, and no one guilty. You forget, Mary Monson, interposed the judge mildly, that the robbery and the piece of money found in your purse give a color to the supposition of crime. The jury have doubtless been influenced by these facts, and important facts they are. No one can deny this, and I think you overlook that feature of your case. If, however, your counsel has any good reason to offer why sentence should not now be pronounced, the court will hear it. There is no impatience on the part of justice, which would much rather draw in than stretch forth its arm. Perhaps, Mary Monson, you might do well to leave to your counsel the objections you wish to urge, and let them be presented to us in a form that we can recognize. I see no great use in deferring the sentence, Dunscombe remarked, quietly enough for the circumstances. It must be pronounced, and any question of law, should one occur to my mind, though I confess none does at present, can as well be raised after this ceremony as before. I am disposed to wait, if a good reason can be urged for the delay. I will acknowledge that the case is one involved in a great deal of doubt and uncertainty, and am much inclined to do all the law will sanction. Still, I leave you to decide on your own course. In my judgment, may it please your honor, we shall have to go to the executive, and it were, perhaps, better to get all the most revolting parts of the case over, while the accused, convicted, Mr. Dunscombe. It is a distinction painful to make, but one that cannot now be avoided. I beg pardon of the court. Convicted. Yes, said Mary Monson solemnly, I am convicted, and of the revolting crime of murder. All my hopes of a triumphant acquittal are blasted, and whatever may be the termination of this extraordinary affair, a dark spot will always rest on my name. Sir, I am as innocent of this crime as the youngest child in your county. I may have been willful, perverse, ill-judging, unwise, and have 100 other failings, but neither Peter nor Dorothy Goodwin did I ever harm. I had not been long in the house before I discovered that the old couple were not happy together. They quarreled often and bitterly. The wife was managing, dictatorial, and sordidly covetous, while he used every shilling he could obtain for the purchase of liquors. His mind was affected by his debauches, and he drivelled. In this state he came to me for sympathy and advice. There were passages in my own past life, short as it has been, which disposed me to feel for one who was not happy in the married state. It is no matter what my own experience has been. I had sympathy for that poor man. So far from wishing to do him harm, I desired to do him good. I advised him to quit the house and live apart from his wife, for a time at least, and this he consented to do, if I would furnish him with the means. Those means I promised, and, that he might not suffer, being of only feeble intellect, and in order to keep him from liquor, I had directed 2 of my agents to come to the house early in the morning of the very day that the fire happened, that they might convey Peter Goodwin to another residence, where he would be secret and safe, until his wife might repent of her treatment of him. It was fortunate for me that I had done this. Those 2 men, servants of my own, in the dress of countrymen, were the instruments of saving my life. Without their aid, I should have perished in the flames. What they did and how they did it, it would be premature now to say. Alas, alas! I have not been acquitted as I desired to be, and a dark shadow will forever rest on my name. For the first time, a doubt of the sanity of the prisoner crossed the mind of the judge. It was not so much the incoherence of her language as her eye, the flushed cheek, and a certain air of stealthy cunning that awakened this distrust. Nevertheless, Mary Monson's manner was sincere, her language chosen and perfectly proper, and her explanations not without their force. There was something so strange, however, in a portion of her statements, so irreconcilable with a sound discretion, that, taken with the little which had come to light concerning this singular woman's past life, the doubt arose. "Perhaps it were better, Mr. District Attorney," the judge observed, "if we delay the sentence. As your honor may think fit, the state is not over-anxious for life. What say you, Mr. Dunscombe? Shall there be delay, or shall I sentence?" "As the sentence must come, the sooner it is over the better. We have no ground on which to carry up the case, the jury being judges of the facts. Our principal hope must be in the discretion of the governor. Mary Monson," continued the judge, evidently treating the affair as purely a matter of form, "you have been tried for feloniously depriving Peter Goodwin of his life." "I never did it," interrupted the prisoner, in a voice so low as to be melodious, yet so clear as to be audible as the sound of a clarion. "These men have been influenced by the rumors they have heard, and were not fit to act as my judges. Men should have minds superior to mere reports, to sit in that box. My duty is to pronounce the sentence of the law. After a fair trial, and, so far as it appears to us, by an impartial jury, you have been found guilty. For reasons that are of sufficient weight to my mind, I shall not dwell on the character of the awful change you will have to undergo, should this decree be put in force, but confine myself simply to the duty of pronouncing the sentence of the law, which is this: that you be carried back to the jail and there be guarded until Friday, the 6th day of September next, when between the hours of 12 and 2 p.m. you be carried to the place of execution and hanged by the neck until you are dead. And God have mercy on your soul." A shudder passed through the audience at hearing language like this applied to a person of Mary Monson's appearance, education, and sex. This feeling might have manifested itself more strongly had not Mrs. Horton attracted attention to herself by forcing her way through the crowd until she stood within the bar. Here the good woman, accustomed to bandy words with her guests, did not scruple to make her presence known to the court by calling out, "They tell me, Your Honor, that Mary Monson has just been found guilty of the murder of Peter Goodwin." "It is so, my good woman, but that case is ended. Mr. Sheriff, remove the prisoner. Time is precious." "Yes, Your Honor, and so is eternity. Mary Monson is no more guilty of taking the life of Peter Goodwin than I am guilty. I've always said some great disgrace would befall our juries one of these days, and now my prophecy will come true. Dukes is disgraced. Constable, let that poor man come within the bar." The driveling creature who entered the room of McBrain tottered forward, when 20 voices cried aloud the name of Peter Goodwin. Every word that Mary Monson had stated was true. End of chapter 27. Read by Nick Autorina. Woodstock, Georgia, June 15th, 2026. Section 28 of The Ways of the Hour. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ways of the Hour by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 28. Now, Marcia, now call up to thy assistance thy wonted strength and constancy of mind. Thou canst not put it to a greater trial. Addison. Bench, bar, jury, witnesses, and audience were all astounded. The trial had been carried on in the most perfect good faith, and not a human being but the few who had felt the force of McBrain's testimony doubted of the death of the individual who now appeared alive, if not well, in open court. The reader can better imagine than we can describe the effects of a resurrection so entirely unexpected. When the confusion naturally produced by such a scene had a little subsided, when all had actually seen and many had actually felt the supposed murdered man, as if to assure themselves of his being really in the flesh, order was restored, and the court and bar began to reflect on the course next to be pursued. "I suppose, Mr. District Attorney," observed His Honor, "there is no mistake in the person of this individual, but it were better if we had an affidavit or two. Will you walk this way, sir?" A long private conference now took place between the public prosecutor and the judge. Each expressed his astonishment at the result, as well as some indignation at the deception which had been practiced on the court. This indignation was a little mollified by the impression, now common to both, that Mary Monson was a person not exactly in her right mind. There was so much deception practiced among persons accused of crimes, however, and in connection with this natural infirmity, that public functionaries like themselves were necessarily very cautious in admitting the plea. The most offensive part of the whole affair was the discredit brought on the justice of dukes. It was not in nature for these individuals to be insensible to the sort of disgrace the reappearance of Peter Goodwin entailed on the county and circuit, and there was a very natural desire to wipe off the stain. The conference lasted until the affidavits to establish the facts connected with Goodwin's case were ready. "Had these affidavits been presented earlier," said His Honor, as soon as the papers were read, "sentence would not have been pronounced. The case is novel, and I shall want a little time to reflect on the course I am to take. The sentence must be gotten rid of by some means or other, and it shall be my care to see it done. I hope, Brother Dunscombe, the counsel for the accused have not been parties to this deception?" "I am as much taken by surprise as your honor can possibly be," returned the party addressed, with earnestness, "not having had the most remote suspicion of the existence of the man said to have been murdered. Else would all the late proceedings have been spared. As to the course to be taken next, I would respectfully suggest that the code be examined. It is an omnium gatherum, and must contain something to tell us how to undo all we have done." "It were better for all parties had they so been. There are still 2 indictments pending over Mary Monson, one for the arson and the other for the murder of Dorothy Goodwin. Mr. District Attorney feels the necessity of trying these cases, or one of them at least, in vindication of the justice of the state and county, and I am inclined to think that, under all the circumstances, this course should be taken. I trust we shall have no more surprises, and that Dorothy Goodwin will be brought forward at once, if still living. Time is precious." "Dorothy Goodwin is dead," said Mary Monson solemnly. "Poor woman, she was called away suddenly, and in her sins. Little fear of her ever coming here to flout your justice." "It may be well to caution your client, Mr. Dunscombe, against hasty and indiscreet admissions. Let the accused be arraigned, and a jury be impaneled. Which case do you choose to move on, Mr. District Attorney?" Dunscombe saw that His Honor was offended, and much in earnest. He was offended himself, and half disposed to throw up his brief, but he felt for the situation of a lovely and defenseless woman. Then his doubts touching his client's sanity began to take the character of certainty, and he saw how odious it would be to abandon one so afflicted in her emergency. He hinted his suspicion to the court, but was told that the fact, under all the circumstances of the case, was one properly for the jury. After reflection, the advocate determined not to desert his trust. We pass over the preliminary proceedings. A jury was impaneled with very little difficulty, not a challenge having been made. It was composed in part of those who had been in the box on the late occasion, and in part of new men. There was an air of earnestness and business about them all that Timms did not like, but it was too late to raise objections. To own the truth, the senior counsel cared much less than before for the result, feeling satisfied that his contemplated application at Albany would meet with consideration. It is true, Mary Monson was no anti-renter. She could not come forward with her demand for mercy with hands dyed in the blood of an officer of that public which lives under the deception of fancying it rules the land. Murderers who added to their crimes the hateful and pestilent fraud of attempting to cloak robbery in the garb of righteous liberty. Nor could she come sustained by numbers around the ballot box, and bully the executive into acts which the reason and conscience of every honest man condemn. But Dunscombe believed that she might come with the plea of a being visited by the power of her Creator, in constituting her as she was, a woman not morally accountable for her acts. All the leading facts, as shown on the former trial, were shown on this. When the county practitioners were called on to give their opinions concerning the effect of the blow, they necessarily became subject to the cross-examination of the counsel for the prisoner, who did not spare them. "Were you examined, sir, in the late trial of Mary Monson for the murder of Peter Goodwin?" demanded Dunscombe of the first of these modern Galens who was put on the stand. "I was, sir." "What did you say on that occasion?" looking at his notes of the other trial. "Touching the sex of the persons to whom those skeletons were thought to have belonged." "I said I believed, not knew, but believed, they were the remains of Peter and Dorothy Goodwin." "Did you not use stronger language than that?" "Not that I remember. I may have done so, but I do not remember it." "Did you not say you had no doubt that those were the remains of Peter and Dorothy Goodwin?" "I may have said as much as that. Now you mention the words, I believe I did." "Do you think so now?" "Certainly not. I cannot think so after what I have seen." "Do you know Peter Goodwin personally?" "Very well. I have practiced many years in this neighborhood." "Whom then do you say that this unfortunate man here, whom we see alive, though a driveler, really is?" "Peter Goodwin. He who was thought to have been murdered. We are all liable to make mistakes." "You have testified in chief that, in your judgment, the two persons of whom we have the remains here in court were stunned at least, if not absolutely killed, by the blow that you think fractured each of their skulls. Now, I would ask if you think the prisoner at the bar possesses the physical force necessary to enable her to strike such a blow." "That would depend on the instrument she used. A human skull may be fractured easily enough by a moderate blow struck by a heavy instrument." "What sort of instrument, for instance?" "A sword, a bar of iron, or anything that has weight and force." "Do you believe those fractures were given by the same blow?" "I do, by one and the same blow." "Do you think Mary Monson possesses the strength necessary to cause those two fractures at a single blow?" Witness has no opinion on the subject. "Are the fractures material?" "Certainly, and must have required a heavy blow to produce them." This was all that could be got from either of the witnesses on that material point. As respected McBrain, he was subsequently examined in reference to the same facts. Dunscombe made good use of this witness, who now commanded the respect of all present. In the first place, he was adroitly offered to the jury as the professional man who had, from the first, given it as his opinion that both the skeletons were those of females, and this in the face of all the collected wisdom of Dukes County, an opinion that was now rendered so probable as almost to amount to certainty. He, Dunscombe, believed most firmly that the remains were those of Dorothy Goodwin and the German woman who was missing. "Have you examined those skeletons, Dr. McBrain?" Dunscombe asked. "I have, sir, and carefully, since the late trial." "How do you think the persons to whom they belonged came to their deaths?" "I find fractures in the skulls of both. If they lie now as they did when the remains were found, a fact that had been proved by several witnesses, I am of opinion that a single blow inflicted the injuries on both. It may be that the blow was not sufficient to produce death, but it must have produced a stupor or insensibility, which would prevent the parties from seeking refuge against the effects of the flames." "Is the learned witness brought here to sum up the cause?" demanded Williams, with one of those demoniacal sneers of his, by means of which he sometimes carried off a verdict. "I wish to know, that I may take notes of the course of this argument." McBrain drew back, shocked and offended. He was naturally diffident, as his friend used to admit, in everything but wives, and as regarded them he had the impudence of the devil. Ned would never give up the trade until he married a dozen, if the law would see him out in it. He ought to have been a follower of the great Mahomet, who made it a point to take a new wife at almost every new moon. The judge did not like this sneer of Williams, and this so much the less, because, in common with all around him, he had imbibed a profound respect for the knowledge of the witness. It is true, he was very much afraid of the man, and dreaded his influence at the polls, but he really had too much conscience to submit to everything. A judge may yet have a conscience, if the code will let him. "This is very irregular, Mr. Williams, not to say improper," His Honor mildly remarked. "The witness has said no more than he has a right to say, and the court must see him protected. Proceed with your testimony, sir." "I have a little more to say, if it please the court," resumed McBrain, too much dashed to regain his self-possession in a moment. As this was all Williams wanted, he permitted him to proceed in his own way, and all the doctor had to say was soon told to the jury. The counsel for the prosecution manifested great tact in not cross-examining the witness at all. In a subsequent stage of the trial, Williams had the impudence to insinuate to the jury that they did not attach sufficient importance to his testimony to subject him to this very customary ordeal. But the turning point of this trial, as it had been that of the case which preceded it, was the evidence connected with the piece of money. As the existence of the notch was now generally known, it was easy enough to recognize the coin that had been found in Mary Monson's purse, thus depriving the accused of one of her simplest and best means of demonstrating the ignorance of the witnesses. The notch, however, was Mrs. Burton's great mark, under favor of which her very material testimony was now given as it had been before. Dunscombe was on the point of commencing the cross-examination when the clear, melodious voice of Mary Monson herself was heard for the first time since the commencement of the trial. "Is it permitted to me to question this witness?" demanded the prisoner. "Certainly," answered the judge. "It is the right of everyone who is arraigned by the country. Ask any question that you please." This was a somewhat liberal decision as to the right of cross-examining, and the accused put on it a construction almost as broad as the privilege. As for the witness, it was very apparent she had little taste for the scrutiny that she probably foresaw she was about to undergo, and her countenance, attitude, and answers, each and all betrayed how much distaste she had for the whole procedure. As permission was obtained, however, the prisoner did not hesitate to proceed. "Mrs. Burton," said Mary Monson, adopting, as well as she knew how, the manner of the gentleman of the bar, "I wish you to tell the court and jury when you first saw the notched piece of money." "When I first saw it? I saw it first when Aunt Dolly first showed it to me," answered the witness. Most persons would have been dissatisfied with this answer, and would probably have caused the question to be repeated in some other form. But Mary Monson seemed content, and went on putting her questions just as if she had obtained answers to meet her views. Did you examine it well? As well as I desired to. There was nothing to prevent it. Did you know it immediately on seeing it in my purse? Certainly, as soon as I saw the notch. Did Mrs. Goodwin point out the notch to you, or did you point out the notch to her? She pointed it out to me. She feared that the notch might lessen the value of the coin. All this I have heard before, but I now ask you, Mrs. Burton, in the name of that being whose eye is everywhere, did you not yourself put that piece of money in my purse when it was passing from hand to hand, and take it out of it the piece without a notch? Answer me, as you have a regard for your soul. Such a question was altogether out of the rules regulating the queries that may be put to witnesses, an answer in the affirmative going directly to criminate the respondent. But the earnest manner, solemn tones, and, we may add, illuminated countenance of Mary Monson so far imposed on the woman that she quite lost sight of her rights, if she ever knew them. What is much more remarkable, neither of the counsel for the prosecution interposed an objection. The district attorney was willing that justice should have its way, and Williams began to think it might be prudent to manifest less anxiety for a conviction than he had done in the case in which the party murdered had been resuscitated. The judge was entranced by the prisoner's manner. "I believe I have as much regard for my soul as any of the neighbors have for theirs," answered Mrs. Burton sullenly. "Let us learn that in your reply. Did you or did you not change those pieces of gold?" "Perhaps I might. It's hard to say, when so much was said and done." "How came you with the other piece, with which to make the exchange? Answer, Sarah Burton, as you fear God?" The witness trembled like an aspen leaf. So remarkable was the scene that no one thought of interfering, but the judge, the bar, and the jury seemed equally willing to leave the two females to themselves as the most efficient means of extorting the truth. Mary Monson's color heightened. Her mien and countenance grew, as it were, with the occasion, while Sarah Burton's became paler and paler as each question was put and the reply pressed. "I can have money, I hope, as well as other folks," answered the witness. "That is no reply. How came you with a piece of gold that is notched, that you could exchange it for the piece that was not notched, and which was the one really found in my purse? Answer me that, Sarah Burton, here, where we both stand in the presence of our great Creator?" "There's no need of your pressing a body so awfully. I don't believe it's law. I repeat the question, or I will answer it for you. When you fired the house," the woman screamed and raised her hands in natural horror. "I never set the house on fire," she cried. "It took from the stovepipe in the garret, which it had taken twice before." "How can you know that, unless you saw it?" "How see it, unless present?" "I was not there, and did not see it, but I know the garret had caught twice before from that cook stove pipe. Aunt Dolly was very wrong to neglect it as she did." "And the blows on the head? Who struck those blows, Sarah Burton?" "How can I tell? I wasn't there. No one but a fool could believe you have strength to do it." "How, then, was it done? Speak. I see it in your mind." "I saw the plowshare lying on the heads of the skeletons, and I saw Moses Steen throw it off, in the confusion of first raking the embers. Moses will be likely to remember it, if sent for and questioned." Here was a most important fact elicited under the impulse of self-justification, and a corresponding expression of surprise passed in a murmur through the audience. The eye of Mary Monson kindled with triumph, and she continued with renewed powers of command over the will and conscience of the witness. "This is well, Sarah Burton. It is right, and what you ought to say. You think that the fire was accidental, and that the fractured skulls came from the fall of the plow?" "I do. I know that the plow stood in the garret, directly over the bed, and the stovepipe passed quite near it. There was an elbow in that pipe, and the danger was at that elbow." "This is well, and the eye above looks on you with less displeasure, Sarah Burton." As this was said, the witness turned her looks timidly upwards. as if to assure herself of the fact. "Speak holy truth, and it will soon become benignant and forgiving. Now tell me how you came by the stocking and its contents." "The stocking?" said the witness, starting and turning white as a sheet. "Who says I took the stocking?" "I do. I know it by that secret intelligence which has been given me to discover truth. Speak, then, Sarah, and tell the court and jury the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." "Nobody saw me take it, and nobody can say I took it." "Therein you are mistaken. You were seen to take it. I saw it, for one. But there was another who saw it, with its motive, whose eye is ever on us. Speak, then, Sarah, and keep nothing back." "I meant no harm if I did take it. There were so many folks about. I was afraid that some stranger might lay hands on it. That's all." "You were seen to unlock the drawers, as you stood alone near the bureau, in the confusion and excitement of finding of the skeletons. You did it stealthily, Sarah Burton." "I was afraid someone might snatch the stocking from me. I always meant to give it up, as soon as the law said to whom it belongs. Davis wants it, but I'm not sure it is his." "What key did you use? Keep nothing back." "One of my own. My keys unlocked many of Aunt Dolly's drawers. She knew it and never found any fault with it. Why should she? Her keys unlocked mine." "Another word. Where is that stocking, and where are its contents?" "Both are safe in the third drawer of my own bureau, and here's the key," taking one from her bosom. "I put them there for security, as no one opens that drawer but myself." Timms took the key from the unresisting hand of the woman, and followed by Williams, Davis, and one or two more, he left the courthouse. At that instant, Sarah Burton fainted. In the confusion of removing her into another room, Mary Monson resumed her seat. "Mr. District Attorney, it can hardly be your intention to press this indictment any further," observed the judge, wiping his eyes, and much delighted with the unexpected termination of the affair. The functionary addressed was glad enough to be rid of his unwelcome office, and at once signified his willingness to enter a nolle prosequi by an application to the bench in the case of the arson, and to submit to an acquittal in that now being traversed. After a brief charge from the judge, the jury gave a verdict of acquittal, without leaving the box, and just as this was done, Timms and his companions returned, bringing with them the much-talked-of stocking. It required months completely to elucidate the whole affair, but so much is already known, and this part of our subject being virtually disposed of, we may as well make a short summary of the facts as they were already in proof, or as they have since come to light. The fire was accidental. As has been recently ascertained by circumstances it is unnecessary to relate. Goodwin had left his wife the night before the accident, and she had taken the German woman to sleep with her. As the garret floor above this pair was consumed, the plow fell, its share inflicting the blow which stunned them, if it did not inflict even a greater injury. That part of the house was first consumed, and the skeletons were found, as has been related, side by side. In the confusion of the scene, Sarah Burton had little difficulty in opening the drawer and removing the stocking. She fancied herself unseen, but Mary Monson observed the movement, though she had then no idea what was abstracted. The unfortunate delinquent maintains that her intention, at the time, was good, or that her sole object was to secure the gold, but is obliged to confess that the possession of the treasure gradually excited her cupidity, until she began to hope that this hoard might eventually become her own. The guilty soonest suspect guilt. As to the pure, all things are pure, so it is with the innocent, who are the least inclined to suspect others of wicked actions. Thus was it with Mrs. Burton. In the commission of a great wrong herself, she had little difficulty in supposing that Mary Monson was the sort of person that rumor made her out to be. She saw no great harm, then, in giving a shove to the descending culprit. When looking into the stocking, she had seen, and put in her own pocket, the notched piece as a curiosity, there being nothing more unusual in the guilty thus incurring unnecessary risks than there is in the moth's temerity in fluttering around the candle. When the purse of Mary Monson was examined, as usually happens on such occasions, we had almost said as always happens, in the management of cases that are subsequently to form a part of the justice of the land, much less attention was paid to the care of that purse than ought to have been bestowed on it. Profiting by the neglect, Sarah Burton exchanged the notched coin for the perfect piece, unobserved, as she again fancied, but once more the watchful eye of Mary Monson was on her. The first time the woman was observed by the last, it was accidentally, but suspicion once aroused, it was natural enough to keep a lookout on the suspected party. The act was seen, and at the moment that the accused thought happy, the circumstance was brought to bear on the trial. Sarah Burton maintains that, at first, her sole intention was to exchange the imperfect for the perfect coin, and that she was induced to swear to the piece subsequently produced, as that found on Mary Monson's person, as a literal fact, ignorant of what might be its consequences. Though the devil doubtless leads us on, step by step, deeper and deeper, into crime and sin, it is probable that, in this particular, the guilty woman applied a flattering unction to her conscience, that the truth would have destroyed. Great was the wonder, and numberless were the paragraphs that this unexpected issue of the great Bibbery murders produced. As respects the last, anything that will fill a column is a godsend, and the falsehood has even a value that is not to be found in the truth, as its contradiction will help along quite as much as the original statements. If the public could only be brought to see what a different thing publicity becomes in the hands of those who turn it to profit from what it is thought to be, by those who fancy it is merely a mode of circulating facts, a great step towards a much-needed reformation would be taken, by confining the last within their natural limits. Mary Monson's name passed from one end of the Union to the other, and thousands heard and read of this extraordinary woman, who never had the smallest clue to her real character or subsequent history. How few reflected on the defects of the system that condemned her to the gallows on insufficient testimony, or, under another phase of prejudice, might have acquitted her when guilty. The random decisions of the juries, usually well-meaning, but so rarely discriminating, or as intelligent as they ought to be, attract very little attention beyond the bar, and even the members of that often strike a balance in error, with which they learn to be content, gaining in one cause as much as they lose in another. There was a strong disposition in the people assembled at Bibbery, on the occasion of the trial, to make a public spectacle of Mary Monson. The right to do this, with all things in heaven and earth, seems to belong to republican simplicity, which is beginning to rule the land with a rod of iron. Unfortunately for this feeling, the subject of momentary sympathy was not a person likely to allow such a license. She did not believe, because she had endured one set of atrocious wrongs, that she was bound to submit to as many more as gaping vulgarity might see fit to inflict. She sought the protection of good Mrs. Gott and her jail, some forms being necessary before the sentence of death could be legally gotten rid of. In vain were the windows again crowded, with the virtuous wish of seeing how Mary Monson looked. Now she was acquitted, just as they had been previously thronged in order to ascertain how she looked when there was a chance of her being condemned to the gallows. The most extraordinary part of the affair was the circumstance that the harp became popular, the very sentiment, act, or thing that, in one condition of the common mind, is about to be cut down and cast into the fire, becoming in another all that is noble, commendable, or desirable. The crowd about the windows of the jail, for the first few hours after the acquittal, was dying to hear the prisoner sing and play, and would gladly have tolerated the harp and a foreign tongue to be thus gratified. But Mary Monson was safe from all intrusion, under the locks of the delighted Mrs. Gott. This kind-hearted person kissed her prisoner, over and over again, when she admitted her within the gallery, and then she went outside and assured several of the more respectable persons in the crowd how thoroughly she had been persuaded, from the first, of the innocence of her friend. The circumstances of this important trial rendered Mrs. Gott a very distinguished person herself in that crowd, and never was a woman happier than she while delivering her sentiments on the recent events. "It's altogether the most foolish trial we have ever had in dukes, though they tell me foolish trials are getting to be only too common," said the kind-hearted wife of the chief, addressing half a dozen of the more respectable of the crowd. "It gave me a big fright, I will own. When Gott was elected sheriff, I did hope he would escape all executions, but debt executions. The more he has of them, the better. It's bad enough to escort thieves to Sing Sing, but the gallows is a poor trade for a decent man to meddle with. Then, to have the very first sentence, one against Mary Monson, who is as much above such a punishment as virtue is above vice. When I heard those dreadful words, I felt as if a cord was round my own neck. But I had a faith to the last. Mary has always told me that she should be acquitted, and here it has all come true at last." "Do you know Mrs. Gott?" said one of her friends. "It is reported that this woman, or lady, I suppose one must now call her, has been in the habit of quitting the jail whenever she saw fit." "Hush, neighbor Brooks. There is no need of alarming the county. I believe you are right, though it was all done without my knowledge, or it never would have been permitted. It only shows the power of money. The locks are as good as any in the state, yet Mary certainly did find means, unbeknown to me, to open them. It can't be called breaking jail, since she always came back. I had a good fright the first time I heard of it, but use reconciles us to all things. I never let God into the secret, though he's responsible, as he calls it, for all his prisoners. Well, when a matter turns out happily, it does no good to be harping on it always." Mrs. Gott assented, and in this case, as in 100 others, the end was made to justify the means. But Mary Monson was felt to be an exception to all rules, and there was no longer any disposition to cavil at any of her proceedings. Her innocence had been established so very triumphantly that every person regarded her vagaries and strange conduct with indulgence. At that very moment, when Mrs. Gott was haranguing her neighbors at the door of the jail, Dunscombe was closeted with Michael Millington at the inn, the young man having returned at hot speed only as the court adjourned. He had been successful, notwithstanding his original disappointment, and had ascertained all about the hitherto mysterious prisoner of the Bibury jail. Mary Monson was, as Dunscombe suspected, Mildred Millington by birth, Madame de la Rochefort by marriage, and she was the granddaughter of the very woman to whom he had been betrothed in youth. Her insanity was not distinctly recognized, perhaps could not have been legally established, though it was strongly suspected by many who knew her intimately, and was a source of great uneasiness with all who felt an interest in her welfare. Her marriage was unhappy, and it was supposed she had taken up her abode in the cottage of the Goodwins to avoid her husband. The command of money gave her a power to do very much as she pleased, and, though the breath of calumny had never yet blown its withering blast on her name, she erred in many things that are duties as grave as that of being chaste. The laws came in aid of her whims and caprices. There is no mode by which an errant wife can be made to perform her duties in boldly experimenting New York, though she can claim a support and protection from her husband. The cup and saucer law comes in aid of this power, and the men who cannot keep their wives in the chains of hymen in virtue of the affections may just as well submit, with a grace, to be the victims of an ill-judging and most treacherous regard for the rights of what are called the weaker sex. End of chapter 28. Read by Nick Autorina. Woodstock, Georgia. June 16th, 2026.
Section 29 of The Ways of the Hour, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Ways of the Hour by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 29. Why wilt thou add to all the griefs I suffer, imaginary ills and fancied tortures? Cato. The scene must now be shifted to Rattletrap. Bibury was deserted. Even the rumors with which its streets had been so lately filled were already forgotten. None have memories as frail as the gossip. Not only does this class of persons, and a numerous class it is, including nearly all whose minds are not fitted to receive more elevated materials, not only, we say, does this class of persons overlook the contradictions and absurdities of the stories they repeat, but they forget the stories themselves almost as soon as heard. Such was now the case at Bibury. Scarce an individual could be found in the place who would acknowledge that he or she had ever heard that Mary Monson was connected with robbers, or who could recollect that he once fancied the accused guilty. We may as well say here that nothing has ever been done with Sarah Burton. She is clearly guilty. But the law, in these times of progress, disdains to pursue the guilty. Their crimes are known, and of what use can it be to expose those whom everyone can see are offenders? No, it is the innocent who have most reason to dread the law. They can be put to trouble, cost, vexation, and loss, if they cannot be exactly condemned. We see how thousands regard the law in a recent movement in the legislature, by which suits have been ordered to try the titles of most of the large landed proprietors, with the very honest and modest proposal annexed, that their cases shall be prejudged, and the landlords deprived of the means of defending themselves by sequestering their rents. Everybody says this is the freest country on earth, the only country that is truly free, but we must be permitted to say that such a law, like 20 more that have been passed in the same interest within the last 10 years, savors a good deal of the character of a ukase. Our characters, with the exception of McBrain and his bride, were now assembled at Rattletrap. Dunscombe had ascertained all it was necessary to know concerning Mildred, and had taken the steps necessary to protect her. Of her qualified insanity he did not entertain a doubt, though it was a madness so concealed by the blandishments of education and the graces of a refined woman that few saw it, and fewer still wished to believe it true. On most subjects this unhappy lady was clear-minded and intelligent enough, more especially on that of money, for while her expenditures were generous, and her largesses most liberal, she manifested wonderful sagacity in taking care of her property. It was this circumstance that rendered it so difficult to take any steps to deprive her of its control. Though Dunscombe had seen enough in the course of the recent trial to satisfy him that such a measure ought to be resorted to in the interest of her own character. It was in cunning, and in all the low propensities connected with that miserable quality, that Mildred Millington, as she now insisted on calling herself, most betrayed her infirmity. Many instances of it have been incidentally related in the course of our narrative, however unpleasant such an exhibition has been. There is nothing more repugnant to the principles or tastes of the right thinking and right feeling than the practices which cunning engenders. Timms, however, was a most willing agent in all the schemes of his client, though some of her projects had puzzled him by their elaborate duplicity, as much as they had astounded him by their boldness. These were the schemes that had their origin in obliquity of mind. Still, they were not without merit in the eyes of Tims, who was cunning without being mad. Before quitting Bibury, Tims was liberally paid and dismissed. Dunscombe explained to him the situation of his handsome client, without adverting to the state of her mind, when the attorney at once caught at the chances of a divorce. Among the other ways of the hour, that of dissolving the marriage tie had got to be a sort of fashionable mania. Neither time, nor duties, nor children seemed to interpose any material obstacle. And if our own laws do not afford the required facilities, those of some of our more liberal neighbors do. Tims keeps this principle in his mind, and is at this moment ruminating on the means by which he can liberate his late client from her present chains, and bind her anew in some of his own forging. It is scarcely necessary to add that Mildred troubles herself very little in the premises, so far as this covert lover is concerned. The ridicule of Williams was at first the sorest portion of Tim's disappointment. Bachelors alike, and rivals for popular favor, these two worthies had long been looking out for advantageous marriages. Each had the sagacity to see that his chances of making a more and more eligible connection were increasing slowly, and that it was a great thing for a rising man to ascend without dragging after him a wife chosen from among those that prop the base of the great social ladder. It was nuts to one of these competitors for the smiles of the ladies to discover that his rival was in love with a married woman, and this so much the more because the prospects of Tim's success, arising from his seeming intimacy with the fair occupant of the jail, had given Williams a very serious fright. Place two men in competition, no matter in what, and all their energies become concentrated in rivalry. Again and again had these two individuals betrayed their mutual jealousy. And now that one of them had placed himself in a position so false, not to say ridiculous, the other did not fail to enjoy his disappointment to the top of his bent. It was in this manner that Saucy Williams took his revenge for the defeat in the trial. Mrs. Gott was also at Rattletrap. Dunscombe retained much of his original tenderness for Mildred, the grandmother of his guest of that name, and he granted her descendant every indulgence she could ask. Among other things, one of the requests of the liberated prisoner was to be permitted to manifest this sense of her gratitude for the many acts of kindness received from the wife of the sheriff. Gott, accordingly, was left to take care of himself, while his nice little companion was transported to a scene that she found altogether novel, or a temporary residence in a gentleman's dwelling. Sarah's housekeeping, Sarah's good nature, attentions, neatness, attire, and attractions would have been themes to monopolize all of the good little woman's admiration, had not Anna Updike, then on a visit at Rattletrap, quite fairly come in for her full share. She might almost be said to be in love with both. It was just after breakfast that Mildred locked an arm in that of Anna, and led her young friend by one of the wooded paths that runs along the shores of the Hudson, terminating in a summer house with a most glorious view. In this there was nothing remarkable, the eye rarely resting on any of the bits that adorn the banks of that noble stream, without taking in beauties to enchant it. But to all these our two lovely young women were momentarily as insensible as they were to the fact that their own charming forms, floating among shrubbery as fragrant as themselves, added in no slight degree to the beauty of the scene. In manner, Mildred was earnest, if not ardent, and a little excited. On the other hand, Anna was placid, though sensitive. changing color without ceasing, as her thoughts were drawn nearer and nearer to that theme which now included the great object of her existence. "Your uncle brought me letters from town last evening, Anna dear," commenced the liberated lady. "One of them is from Monsieur de la Rochefort. Is that not strange?" "What is there so strange in a husband's writing to his wife? To me it seems the most natural thing in the world." "It does? I'm surprised to hear you say so. You, Anna, whom I regarded as so truly my friend. I have discarded Monsieur de la Rochefort, and he ought to respect my pleasure." "It would have been better, my dear mamma, had you discarded him before marriage instead of after." "Ah, your dear mamma, indeed! I was your school mamma, Anna, and well had it been for me had I been left to finish my education in my own country. Then I should have escaped this most unfortunate marriage. Do not marry, Anna, take my advice, and never marry. Matrimony is unsuited to ladies." "How long have you been of this opinion, dear mamma?" asked the young girl, smiling. "Just as long as I have been made to feel how it crushes a woman's independence, and how completely it gives her a master, and how very, very humiliating and depressing is the bondage it inflicts. Do you not feel the force of my reasons?" "I confess I do not," answered Anna, in a subdued yet clear and distinct voice. "I see nothing humiliating or depressing in a woman's submission to her husband. It is the law of nature, and why should we wish to alter it? My mother has ever inculcated such opinions, and you will excuse me if I say I think the Bible does also." "The Bible! Yes, that is a good book, though I am afraid it is very little read in France. I ought perhaps to say, read very little by strangers resident in France. The French women themselves are not one half as negligent of their duties in this respect as are the strangers who go to reside among them. When the roots that have grown to any size in their native soil are violently transplanted to another, it is not often that the tree obtains its proper dimensions and grace. I wish I had never seen France, Anna, in which case I should never have been Madame de la Rochefort, Vicomtesse by the old law, and I am afraid it was that idle appellation that entrapped me. How much more truly respectable I should have been as Mrs. John Smith, or Mrs. John Brown, or Mrs. David Smith, the wife of a countryman, if I must be a wife at all." "Choose at least some name of higher pretension," said Anna, laughing. "Why not a Mrs. Van Rensselaer, or a Mrs. Van Cortlandt, or a Mrs. Livingston, or a Mrs. somebody else, of one of our good old families?" "Families! Do you know, child, it is treason to talk of families in this age of anti-rentism. They tell me that the man who makes an estate may enjoy it, should he happen to know how, and this, though he may have cheated all he ever dealt with in order to become rich, but that he who inherits an estate has no claim. It is his tenants who have the high moral claim to his father's property. I know nothing of all this, and would rather talk of things I understand." "By which you mean wedlock and its cares. No, my dear, you little understand what matrimony is, or how much humiliation is required of us women to become wives, or you would never think of marrying." "I have never told you that I do think of marrying. That is, not much." "There spoke your honest nature, which will not permit even an unintended deception. This it was that so much attached me to you as a child, for though I am not very ingenuous myself, I can admire the quality in another." "This admission does not exactly prove the truth of your words, mamma," said Anna, smiling. "No matter, let us talk of matrimony. Has John Wilmeder proposed to you, Anna?" This was a home question. No wonder the young lady started. After a short, musing pause, however, the native candor of Anna Updike prevailed, and she admitted that he had. thank you for this confidence, but you must go further. Remember, I am your mamma. Is the gentleman accepted?" A rosy blush, succeeded by a nod of the head, was the answer. "I am sorry I was not consulted before all this happened, though I have managed my own matters so ill as to have very few claims to your confidence. You scarce know what you undertake, my child." "I undertake to become Jack Wilmeder's wife," answered the betrothed, in a very low but a very firm voice, "and I hope I shall make him a good one. Most of all do I pray to be obedient and submissive." "To no man that breathes, Anna. No, to no man breathing. It is their business to submit to us, not we to them." "This is not my reading of the great rule of women's conduct. In my view of our duties, it is the part of woman to be affectionate, mild, patient, and sympathizing, if necessary, forgiving. I firmly believe that, in the end, such a woman cannot fail to be as happy as is permitted to us to be here on earth." "Forgiving!" repeated Mildred, her eyes flashing. "Yes, that is a word often used, yet how few truly practice its teachings. Why should I forgive anyone that has wronged me? Our nature tells us to resent, to punish, if necessary, as you say, to revenge." A slight shudder passed through the frame of Anna, and she unconsciously moved farther from her companion, though their arms still continued locked. "There must be a great difference between France and America, if revenge is ever taught to a woman as a part of her duty," returned the younger female, now speaking with an earnestness she had not before betrayed. "Here we are told that Christianity forbids the very thought of it, and that to forgive is among the very first of our duties. My great instructor in such things has told me that one of the surest evidences of a hopeful state of the feelings is the banishment of everything like resentment, and a desire to be at peace with all around us, to have a perception that we love the race as beings of our own wants and hopes. Is this the sort of love, then, with which you give your hand to young Wilmeder?" Scarlet is not brighter than was the color that now glowed in the cheeks of Anna, stole into her temples, and even diffused itself over her neck and chest. To herself it seemed as if her very hands blushed. Then the power of innocence came to sustain her, and she became calm and steady. "It is not the feeling with which I shall marry John," she said. "Nature has given us another sentiment, and I shall not endeavor to be superior to all of my sex and class. I love John Wilmeder, I own, and I hope to make him happy. To be a dutiful, obedient wife, forever studying his tastes and caprices. I trust I shall not be forever studying the indulgence of my own. I see nothing degrading to a woman in her filling the place nature and Christianity have assigned to her, and in her doing her duty as a wife. These are not my feelings, receiving your terms as you wish them to be understood, but several have told me I ought never to have married. I myself know that I should have been an American, and not a French wife. I have ever heard that greater latitude is given to our sex in France than in this country. That is true in part only. Nothing can exceed the retinue of a French girl, or anything that is decent exceed the want of it, that is manifested by many Americans. On the other hand, a married woman here has no privileges at all, not even in society, while in France, under an air of great seeming propriety, she does very much as she sees fit. It is a mistake, however, to suppose that faithful wives and devoted mothers, most especially the last, are not to be found all over Europe, in France in particular." "I am glad to hear it," cried Anna, with a really gratified air. "It gives me pleasure when I hear of any of our sex behaving as they should behave." "Should behave!" I fear, Anna, a little covert reproach is intended in that remark. Our estimate of the conduct of our friends must depend on our notions of our own duties. Now hearken to my manner of reasoning on this subject. In a physical sense, man is strong, woman is weak, while in a moral sense, woman is strong and man is weak. You admit my premises?" "The first part of them, certainly," said Anna, laughing, "while I pretend to no knowledge of the last." "You surely do not believe that John Wilmeder is as pure, ingenuous, good as you are yourself?" "I see no reason why he should not be. I am far from certain Jack is not even better. It is useless to discuss such a subject with you. The principle of pride is wanting, without which you can never enter into my feelings. I am glad it is so. I fancy John will be all the happier for it. Ah, my dear mamma, I never knew any good come of what you call this principle of pride. We are told to be humble and not to be proud. It may be all the better for us females that rulers are given to us here, in the persons of our husbands. Anna Updike, do you marry John Wilmeder with the feeling that he is to rule? You overlook the signs of the times, the ways of the hour, child, if you do aught so weak. Look around you and see how everybody, almost everything, is becoming independent, our sex included. Formerly, as I have heard elderly persons say, if a woman suffered in her domestic relations, she was compelled to suffer all. The quarrel lasted for a life. Now no one thinks of being so unreasonably wretched. No, the wronged wife, or even the offended wife, Monsieur de la Rochefort, snubs abominably, abominably, yes, abominably. But no wife is obliged, in these times of independence and reason, to endure a snuffy husband. No, broke in Dunscombe, appearing from an adjoining path. She has only to pack up her spoons and be off. The code can never catch her. If it could on one page, my life for it, there is a hole for her to get out of its grasp on the next. Your servant, ladies. I have been obliged to overhear more of your conversation than was intended for my ears, perhaps, these paths running so close to each other, and you being so animated. And now I mean to take an old man's privilege and speak my mind. In the first place, I shall deal with the agreeable. Anna, my love, Jack is a lucky fellow, far luckier than he deserves to be. You carry the right sentiment into wedlock. It is the right of the husband to be the head of his family, and the wife who resists his authority is neither prudent nor a Christian. He may abuse it, it is true, but even then, so long as criminality is escaped, it were better to submit. I approve of every word you have uttered, dear, and thank you for it all in my nephew's name. And now, Mildred, as one who has a right to advise you, by his avowed love for your grandmother, and recent close connection with yourself, let me tell you what I think of those principles that you avow, and also of the state of things that is so fast growing up in this country. In the first place, he is no true friend of your sex who teaches it this doctrine of independence. I should think, it is true I am only a bachelor and have no experience to back me, but I should think that a woman who truly loves her husband would find a delight in her dependence. "Oh, certainly!" exclaimed Anna, biting her tongue at the next instant, and blushing scarlet at her own temerity. "I understand you, child, and approve again. But there comes Jack, and I shall have to turn you over to him, that you may receive a good scolding from headquarters for this abject servitude feeling that you have betrayed. Go, go! His arm is held out already, and harkee, young folk, remember that a new maxim in morals has come in with the code. Principles depend on circumstances. That is the rule of conduct nowadays. That, and anti-rentism, and republican simplicity, and the cup and saucer law, and yes, and the ever-blessed code." Dunscombe was obliged to stop for breath, which gave the young couple an opportunity to walk away. As for Mildred, she stood collected, extremely ladylike in mien, and with a slight degree of hauteur expressed in her countenance. "And now, sir, that we are alone," she said, "permit me to inquire what my part of the lecture is to be. I trust you will remember, however, that while I am Mildred Millington by birth, the law which you so much reverence and admire makes me Madame de la Rochefort." "You mean to say that I have the honor of conversing with a married woman?" "Exactly so, Mr. Dunscombe." "I comprehend you, ma'am, and shall respect your position. You are not about to become my niece, and I can claim no right to exceed the bounds of friendship." "Nay, my dear sir, I do not wish to say this. You have every right to advise. To me you have been a steady and well-judging friend, and this in the most trying circumstances. I am ready to hear you, sir, in deference, if not in your beloved humility. That which I have to say refers solely to your own happiness, Mildred. Your return to America has, I fear, been most inopportune. Among other innovations that are making on every side of us, even to the verge of the dissolution of civilized society, comes the liberty of woman. Need I tell you what will be the next step in this downward career?" "You needs must, Mr. Dunscombe. I do not comprehend you. What will that step be?" "Her licentiousness. No woman can throw off the most sacred of all her earthly duties in this reckless manner, and hope to escape from the doom of her sex. After making a proper allowance for the increase of population, the increase in separated married people is getting to be out of all proportion. Scarce a month passes that one does not hear of some wife who has left her husband, secreted herself with a child, perhaps, as you did in some farmhouse, passing by a different name, and struggling for her rights, as she imagines. Trust me, Mildred, all this is as much opposed to nature as it is to prescribed duties. That young woman spoke merely what an inward impulse, that is incorporated with her very being, prompted her to utter. A most excellent mother! Oh, what a blessing is that to one of your sex! How necessary, how heavenly, how holy! An excellent mother has left her in ignorance of no one duty, and her character has been formed in what I shall term harmony with her sex. I must be plain, Mildred, you have not enjoyed this advantage. Deprived of your parent young, known to be rich, and transplanted to another soil, your education has necessarily been entrusted to hirelings, flatterers, or persons indifferent to your real well-being. Those who have consulted most the reputation of their instruction, and have paid the most attention to those arts which soonest strike the eye and most readily attract admiration. In this their success has been complete, while you think it has not been so much so, sir, in more material things," said the lady haughtily. "Let me be sincere. It is due to my relation to you, to your grandmother, to the past, to the present time. I know the blood that runs in your veins, Mildred. You are self-willed by descent, rich by inheritance, independent by the folly of our legislators. Accident has brought you home at the very moment when our ill-considered laws are unhinging society in many of its most sacred interests, and consulting only an innate propensity, you have ventured to separate from your husband, to conceal yourself in a cottage, a measure, I dare say, that comported well with your love of the romantic. Not so. I was oppressed, annoyed, unhappy at home, and sought refuge in that cottage. Monsieur de la Rochefort has such a passion for snuff, he uses it night and day. Then followed the serious consequences which involved you in so many fearful dangers." "True," interrupted the lady, laying her small gloved hand hastily on his arm. "Very true, dear Mr. Dunscombe. But how cleverly I contrived to escape them all! How well I managed your Mr. Timms, good Mrs. Gott, the puffy, pompous sheriff, that wily Williams, too, whose palm felt the influence of my gold. Oh, the excitement of the last 2 months has been a gift of paradise to me, and for the first time since my marriage have I known what true happiness was." Dunscombe turned, astonished, to his companion, and stared her in the face. Never was the countenance more lovely to the cursory glance, the eye brighter, the cheek with a richer glow on it, or the whole air, mien, and attitude more replete with womanly loveliness and womanly graces. But the observant eye of the lawyer penetrated beyond all these, and detected the unhappy spirit which had gained possession of a tenement so lovely. The expression of the countenance denoted the very triumph of cunning. We pretend not to a knowledge of the arcana of nature, to be able to detect the manner in which the moving principles prompt to good or evil, but we must reject all sacred history, and no small portion of profane, not to believe that agencies exist that are not visible to our ordinary senses, and that our boasted reason, when abandoned to its own support, becomes the victim of those that are malign. We care not by what names these agents are called, imps, demons, evil spirits, or evil passions, but this we do know: let him beware who submits to their control. Better, far better, were it that such a one had never been born. 3 days later, Mildred Millington was in a state that left no doubt of her infirmity. The lucid intervals were long, however, and at such times her mind seemed clear enough on all subjects but one. Divorce was her ruling passion, and in order to effect her purpose, all the extraordinary ingenuity of a most fertile mind was put in requisition. Although means were promptly but cautiously taken to see that she did not squander her large pecuniary resources, Dunscombe early saw that they were uncalled for. Few persons were better qualified to look after their money than was this unfortunate lady, in the midst of the dire visitation that intellectually reduced her below the level of most around her. On this head her sagacity was of proof, though her hand was not closed in the grip of a miser. Accustomed from childhood to a liberal expenditure, she was willing still to use the means that an inscrutable Providence had so liberally placed in her way, her largesses and her charities continuing the same as ever. Down to the present moment, the fund holder, the owner of town property, the mortgagee, and the trader is allowed to enjoy his own, without any direct interference of the demagogue with his rights. But how much longer this exception is to last is known only to the Being who directs the destinies of nations, or at least not to any who are now on earth, surrounded equally by the infirmities and ignorance of the present state. But Mildred was and is yet permitted to exercise her rights over her own property, though care is had to see that no undue advantage is taken of her sex, years, and ignorance. Beyond this, her control was not disputed, and she was suffered to manage her own affairs. She set about the matter of a divorce with the whole energy of her nature, and the cunning of her malady. Timms was again summoned to her service, unknown to Dunscombe, who would never have winked at the measures that were taken, though so much in accordance with the ways of the hour. Provided with proper credentials, this managing agent sought an interview with Monsieur de la Rochefort, a worn-out debauchee of some rank, who, sooth to say, had faults even graver than that of taking snuff. Notwithstanding the great personal attractions of Mildred, the motive for marrying her had been money, as is usually the case in a very great proportion of the connections of the old world, among persons of condition. Love is to succeed, and not to precede matrimony. Mildred had been taught that lesson, and grievously had she been disappointed. The snuff got into her eyes. Monsieur de la Rochefort, Monsieur le Vicomte, as he had been, and was still determined to be, and in all probability will be, in spite of all the French republican simplicity that was ever summoned to a nation's rescue, Monsieur le Vicomte was directly approached by Tims, and a proposal made that he should put himself in a condition to be divorced for a stipulated price. Notwithstanding the opinion of the learned Attorney General of this great state of the European aristocracy, and who in so every way qualified to give such an opinion, ex officio as it might be, Monsieur de la Rochefort declined lending himself to so vile a proposition, Frenchman and noble as he was. Nor did the husband believe that the discreditable proposal came from his wife. He compelled Tims to admit as much, under a menace of losing his case. That worthy was puzzled at this result, for he had made the proposal on his own hook, as he afterwards explained the matter to Williams, in the fullest confidence of republican simplicity, and was astonished at meeting with the self-respect of a gentleman, if with no very elevated principles in a nobleman. It was accordingly necessary to have recourse to some other mode of proceeding. Luckily for the views of Tims and his fair client, one can scarcely go amiss in this country when a divorce is desired. Although a few of the older states remain reasonably inflexible on this subject, in some respects unreasonably so, indeed, they are generally surrounded by communities that are more indulgent. By means of some hocus pocus of the law that we pretend not to explain, the names of Gabriel Jules Vincent Jean Baptiste de la Rochefort, adds Mildred de la Rochefort, were just beginning to steal on the dawn of the newspapers in a case that ere long might blaze in the meridian of gossip. Dunscombe frowned and reproached, but it was too late to recede. He had told Mildred, and he has told Tims, that nuptial knots tied in one community cannot be so readily unloosed in another as many imagine, and that there must at least be good faith, the animus revertendi, in the change of residence that usually precedes the application. But money is very powerful, and smooths 1,000 difficulties. No one could predict the termination. And as the Vicomte, though only to be approached in a more delicate way than that adopted by Tims, was as tired of the connection as his wife, and was very anxious to obtain a larger share of the fortune than the cup and saucer law will give him, it was by no means improbable that the end of the affair would be a quasi-divorce, that would at least enable each party to take his or her own course, without fear of molestation from the other. In the meantime, Millington was married very shortly after the trial. The engagement had not been long, but the parties had known each other intimately for years. The bridegroom, in one sense, was the head of his family, though by no means possessed of its largest fortune. In this character, it devolved on him to care for the interests of his fair relative. Although as much opposed as Dunscombe to the course she was taking, he did not shrink from his duties as a relative, and it is understood that his house is Mildred's home when in town. Rattletrap opened its hospitable doors to the unfortunate woman whenever she chose to visit the place, and Timbully has also claims on her time and presence. Dunscombe announced his intention to retire from practice at the end of a 12-month, the morning that Michael and Sarah were married. In the intervening time, John Wilmeter and his new nephew were received as partners, and the worthy bachelor is now sedulously but silently transferring as respectable and profitable a list of clients as any man in the courts can claim. His own advice is promised at all times to his old friends, and, as not a soul has objected, and the young men bid fair, there is every reason to hope that useful and profitable labor will keep both out of mischief. End of section 29.
Section 2 of Household Words, Issue 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Household Words, Issue 3, by Charles Dickens. The Troubled Water Question. My excellent and eloquent friend Littleton of Pump Court Temple, barrister at law, disturbed me on a damp morning at the end of last month to bespeak my company to a meeting at which he intended to hold forth. It is, he said, the great Water Supply Congress, which assembles tomorrow. Do you know anything of the subject? A vast deal, both practically and theoretically. Practically, I pay for my little box in the Regent's Park twice the price for water our friend Fielding is charged, and both supplies are derived from the same company. Yet his is a mansion, mine is a cottage, his rent more than doubles mine in amount, and his family trebles mine in number. So much for the consistency and exactions of an irresponsible monopoly. Practically, again, there are occasions when my cisterns are without water. So much for deficient supply. Is your water bad? Not absolutely unwholesome, but I have drunk better. Now then, theoretically. Theoretically, I learn from piles of blue books, a regular blue mountain of parliamentary inquiry instituted in the years 1810, 1821, 1827, 1828, 1834, 1840, and 1845, from a cloud of prospectuses issued by embryo water companies, from a host of pamphlets pro and con, and from the reports of the Board of Health, that of the 300,000 houses of which London is said to consist, 70,000 are without the great element of suction and cleanliness. I also find that the supply, such as it is derived from 9 water companies all linked together to form a giant monopoly, and that, in consequence, the charge for water is in some instances excessive, that 6 of these companies draw their water from the filthy Thames, and the same number, including those which use the Lee and New River water, have no system of filtration. Hence it is unwholesome. That, in short, the public of the metropolis are the victims of dear, insufficient, and dirty water. Like Tantalus of old, they are denied much of the great element of life, although it flows within reach of their parched and thirsty lips. And by whom? By that many-headed Cerberus, that 9 gentlemen in one, the great monopolist water company combination of London. Unless, therefore, we bestir ourselves in the great cause for which this numerous, enlightened, and respectable meeting have assembled here this day. You forget, you have only 2 listeners at present, myself and my spaniel. I can suggest a more profitable morning's amusement than a rehearsal of your speech. What? Your theoretical knowledge is, I doubt not, very comprehensive and varied, but second-hand information is not to be trusted too implicitly. Every statement of fact, like every story, gains something in exaggeration, or loses something in accuracy by repetition from book to book, or from book to mouth. Granted, but what do you suggest? Ocular demonstration. Let us at once visit and minutely inspect the works of one of the companies. I am sure they will let us in at the Grand Junction, for I have already been over their premises. A capital notion. Agreed. The preliminaries, consisting of the hasty bundling up of Mr. Littleton's notes for the morrow's oration, and the hire of a hansom cab, were adjusted in a few minutes. The order to drive to Kew Bridge was obeyed in capital style, for in 3/4 of an hour we were deposited on the towing path on the Surrey side of the Thames, opposite the King of Hanover's house, and a 1/4 of a mile west of Kew Bridge. Here, I explained, is the spot whence the Grand Junction Company derive their water. In the bed of the river is an enormous culvert pipe laid parallel to this path. Its mouth, open towards Richmond, is barred across with a grating, to intercept stray fish, murdered kittens, or vegetable impurities, and, except now and then the intrusion edgeways of a small flounder, or the occasional slip of an erratic eel, it admits nothing into the pipe but what is more or less fluid. The culvert then takes a bend round the edge of the islet opposite to us, burrows beneath the Brentford road, and delivers its contents into a well under that tall chimney and taller iron standpipe which you see on the other side of the river. "And is this the stuff I have to pay £4 a year for?" exclaimed Mr. Littleton, contemplating the opaque fluid, part of which was then making its way into the cisterns of Her Majesty's lieges. "Certainly, but it is purified first. We will now cross the bridge to the works." Those of my readers who make prandial expeditions to Richmond must have noticed at the beginning of Old Brentford, a little beyond where they turn over Kew Bridge, an immensely tall, thin column that shoots up into the air like an iron mast, unable to support itself, and seems to require 4 smaller, thinner, and not much shorter props to keep it upright. This, with the engine and engine houses, is all they can see of the Grand Junction waterworks from the road. It is only when one gets inside that the whole extent of the aquatic apparatus is revealed. Determined to follow the water from the Thames till it began its travels to London, we entered the edifice, went straight to the well, and called for a glass of water. Our hosts, who had received our visit without hesitation, supplied us. "That," remarked one of them, as he held the half-filled tumbler up to the light, "is precisely the state of the water as emptied from the Thames into the well." It looked like a dose of weak magnesia, or that peculiar London liquid known as skim-sky blue, but deceitfully sold under the name of milk. "The analysis of Professor Brand," said Littleton, "gives to every gallon of Thames water taken from Kew Bridge 9.2 parts of solid matter, but the water I apprehend in which he experimented must have been taken from the river on a serener occasion than this. Today's rain appears to have drained away the chalk so as to give in this specimen a much larger proportion of solids to fluids than his estimate. In this impure state, one of the engineers told us, the water is pumped by steam power into the reservoirs, to which you will please to follow me." Passing out of the building and climbing a sloping bank, we now saw before us an expanse of water covering 3½ acres, but divided into 2 sections. Into the larger the pump first delivers the water, that so much of the impurity as will form sediment may be precipitated. It then slowly glides through a small opening into the lesser section, which is a huge filter. "The impurities of water," said the barrister, assuming an oratorical attitude, to give us a taste of his reading up, "are of 2 kinds. First, such as are mechanically suspended, say earth, chalk, sand, clay, dead vegetation, or decomposed cats; and secondly, such as are dissolved or chemically combined, like salt, sugar, or alkali. Separation in the one case is easy, in the other it involves a chemical process. If you throw a pinch of sand into a tumbler of water and stir it about, you produce a turbid mixture, but to render the fluid clear again you have only to adopt the simple process of letting it alone. For on setting the tumbler down for a while, the particles, which from their extreme minuteness were easily disturbed and distributed amidst the fluid, being heavier than water, are precipitated, or in other words, fall to the bottom, leaving the liquid translucent. This is what is happening in the larger section of the reservoir to the chalky water of which we drank." "I think I am correct?" asked the speaker, angling for a single cheer from the engineer. "Quite so," replied that gentleman. "Provided the water could remain at rest long enough, which the insatiable maw of the modern Babylon does not allow," continued the honourable orator, rehearsing a bit more of his speech, "this mode of cleansing would be perfectly effectual. In proof of which I may only allude to nature's mode of depuration, as shown in lakes, that of Geneva for instance, The waters of the Rhone enter that expansive reservoir from the Valais in a very muddy condition, yet after reposing in the lake they issue at Geneva as clear as crystal. But so incessant is the London demand that scarcely any time can be afforded for the impurities of the Thames, the Lea, or the New River to separate themselves from the water by mere deposition. True, interjected one of the superintendents. It is for that reason that our water is passed afterwards into the filtering bed, which is 4 feet thick. How do you make up this enormous bed? The water rests upon and permeates through, first, a surface of fine sand, second, a stratum of shells, third, a layer of garden gravel, and fourth, a base of coarse gravel. It then falls through a number of ducts into cisterns, whence it is pumped up so as to commence its travels to town through the conduit pipe. We were returning to the engine-house when Littleton asked the engineer, "Does your experience generally enable you to say that water as supplied by the 9 companies is tolerably pure?" "Upon the whole, yes," was the answer. "Indeed!" ejaculated the orator sharply. "If that be true," he whispered to me in a rueful tone, "I shall be cut out of one of the best points in my speech." "Of course," continued the engineer, "purity entirely depends upon the source and the means of cleansing." "Then, as to the source, how many companies take their supplies from the Thames, near to and after it has received the contents of the common sewers?" "No water is taken from the Thames below Chelsea, except that of the Lambeth Company, which is supplied from between Waterloo and Hungerford Bridges, an objectionable source, which they have obtained an act to change to Thames Ditton. The Chelsea waterworks have a most efficient system of filtration, as also have the Southwark and Vauxhall Company. Both draw their water from between the Red House, Battersea, and Chelsea Hospital. The other companies do not filter. The West Middlesex sucks up some of Father Thames as he passes Barnes Terrace. Except the lowest of these sources, Thames water is nearly as pure as that of other rivers." "Perhaps it is," was the answer, "but the unwholesomeness arises from contaminations received during its course. We don't object to the Thames, but to its tributaries, such as the black contents of common sewers, and the refuse of gut, glue, soap, and other nauseous manufactures, to say nothing of animal and vegetable offal, of which the river is the sole receptacle. Brand shows that, while the solid matter contained in the river at Teddington is 17.4, that which the water has contracted when it flows past Westminster is 24.4, and the City of London 28.0. "But," said the engineer, "these adulterations are only mechanically suspended in the fluid, and are, as you shall see presently, totally separated from it by our mode of filtration. Which brings us to your second point, as to efficient cleansing. You admit that without filtration this is impossible, and also that only 3 companies filter. The deduction, therefore, is that 2/3 of the water supplied to Londoners is insufficiently cleansed. This, indeed, is not a mere inference. We know it for a fact. We see it in our ewers. We taste it out of our carafes. But this does not wholly arise from the inefficient filtration of the 6 companies," returned the officer of this company. "The public is much to blame, though when agitating against an abuse it never thinks of blaming itself. Half the dirt, dust, and animalculae found at table are introduced after the water has been delivered to the houses. Impurity of all sorts finds its way into our outdoor cisterns, even when covered, and few of them, open or closed, are often enough cleansed. In some neighbourhoods water butts are always uncovered, and hardly ever cleaned out. The water is foul, and the companies are blamed." "The blame belongs to the system," said the barrister. "Domestic reservoirs are not only an evil, but an unnecessary expense. Besides filth, they cause waste and deficient supply. They should be abolished, for continuous supply is the real remedy. Let the pipes be always full, and the water would be always ready, always fresh, and could never acquire new impurities. Still, despite all you say, I am bound to conclude that although 1/3 of the water may arrive in the domestic cisterns of the metropolis in a pellucid state, the other 2/3 does not." Mr. L. then inscribed this calculation in his notebook, whispering to me that his pet dirty water point would come out even stronger than he had expected. We had now returned to one of the engine rooms. "You have tasted the water before. I now present you with some of it after filtration," said the chief engineer, handing us a tumbler. "This is exactly the condition in which we deliver it to our customers." It was clear to the eye and to the taste innocuous, but Littleton, who I should mention occasionally turns on powerful streams of oratory at temperance meetings, and is a judge of the article, complained that the liquid wanted flavour. "In other words, then, it wants impurity," replied one of the cicerones with alacrity, "for perfectly pure water is quite tasteless. Indeed, water may be too pure. Distilled water, which contains no salt, is insipid and tends to indigestion. It is a wise provision of nature that waters should contain a greater or less quantity of foreign ingredients, for without these water is dangerous to drink. It never fails to take up from the atmosphere a certain proportion of carbonic acid gas, and when passing through lead pipes it imbibes enough carbonate of lead to constitute poison. Dr. Christison mentions several severe cases of lead or painter's colic, which arose chiefly in country houses to which water was supplied from springs through lead pipes. The most remarkable case was that at Clermont, where the ex-king of the French and several members of his family were nearly poisoned by pure spring water conveyed to the mansion through lead pipes. "Mercy!" I exclaimed, with all the energy of despair that a mere water-drinker is capable of. "If river water be unwholesome, and pure water poison, what is to become of every temperance pledgee?" The engineer relieved me. "All the chemists," he stated, "have agreed that a water containing from 8 to 10 grains of sulphate of magnesia or soda to the imperial gallon is best suited for alimentary, lavatory, and other domestic purposes." We were now introduced to the great engine. What a monster! Imagine an enormous seesaw with a steam engine at one end and a pump at the other. Fancy this beam some 10 yards long and 28 tons in weight, moving on a pivot in the middle, the ends of which show a circumference greater than the crown of the biggest hat ever worn. See with what earnest deliberation the C or engine pulls up the saw, or balance box of the pump, which then comes down upon the water trap with the ferocious aplomb of 49 tons, sending 400 gallons of water in one tremendous squirt, nearly the 20th part of a mile high, that is, to the top of the standpipe. "We have a smaller engine, which does 150 gallons per stroke," remarked our informant. "Each performs 11 strokes and forces up 4,400 gallons of water per minute, and thus our average delivery per diem throughout the year is from 4 million to 5 million gallons." "What proportion of London do you supply?" asked Mr. Littleton. "The quadrangle included between Oxford Street, Wardour Street, Pall Mall, and Hyde Park, besides the whole of Notting Hill, Bayswater, and Paddington. We serve 14,058 houses, to each of which we supply 225 gallons per day, or, taking the average number of persons per house at 9, 25 gallons a head. Besides public services such as baths, watering streets, or manufactories, making our total daily delivery at a rate of 252 gallons per house. This delivery is performed through 80 miles of service pipes, whose diameter varies from 3 to 30 inches. "Now," said my companion, sharpening his pencil, "to go into the question of supply." He then unfolded his pocket soufflé and brought out a calculation of quantities derived, he said, from parliamentary returns and other authorities more or less reliable. New River Company, 20,000,000 gallons daily. Chelsea Company, 3,250,000 gallons daily. West Middlesex Company, 3,650,000 gallons daily. Grand Junction Company, 3,500,000 gallons daily. East London Company, 7,000,000 gallons daily. South Lambeth Company, 2,500,000 gallons daily. South London Company and Southwark Company, 3 million gallons daily. Hampstead Company, 400,000 gallons daily. Total, 44,500,000 gallons daily. Artesian wells, 8 million gallons daily. Land spring pumps, 3 million gallons daily. Catch rainwater, say 1 million gallons daily, making a total quantity supplied daily to London from all sources 56,500,000 gallons daily. An abundant supply, said the engineer eagerly, for as the present population of the metropolis is estimated at 2,336,000, the total affords about 24 gallons of water per day for every man, woman, and child. Admitted, rejoined Littleton, but we have to deal with large deductions. First, nearly half this quantity runs to waste, chiefly in consequence of the intermittent system. I live in a small house with proportionately small cisterns, which are filled no more than 3 times a week. Now, as my neighbours have larger houses and larger reservoirs, the water when turned on runs for as long a time into my small as it does into their capacious cisterns, and consequently if my stop-taps be in the least out of order, a greater quantity descends the waste-pipes than remains behind. This is universally the case in similar circumstances. We supply water daily, Sundays excepted, remarked the engineer. Then you are wiser than your neighbours, but every inconvenience and nearly all the waste would be saved by the adoption of a continuous system of supply. Secondly, a large quantity of water is consumed by cattle, breweries, baths, public institutions, for putting out fires and for laying dust. The lieges of London have only, therefore, to divide between them some 10 gallons of water each per day, and as it is generally admitted that a 6th part of their habitations are without water at all, the division must be most unequally made. That such is the fact is shown by your own figures. Your customers get 25 gallons each per day, or more than double their share. For this excess, some in poorer districts get none at all. That is no fault of the existing companies. As sellers of an article, they are but too happy to get as many customers for it as possible, but poor tenants cannot, and their landlords will not, afford the expense. If the companies were to make the outlay necessary to connect the houses with their mains, they would have no legal power to recover the money so expended. Nor indeed is it clear that were they inclined to run the risk, the parties would avail themselves of it. In one instance, the Southwark and Vauxhall Company offered to construct a tank which would give continuous supply to a block of 100 small houses, at the rate of 50 gallons per diem to each, if the proprietor would pay an additional rate sufficient to yield 5 per cent on the outlay, such additional rate not exceeding 1/2 penny per week for each house, but the offer was declined. That is an extreme case of cheapness on the one side and of stupidity on the other, said the barrister. Other landlords will not turn on water for their tenants because of the expense, not only of the plant in the first instance, but of the after water rent. I find by the account rendered to the House of Commons in 1834 that the South London Company, since incorporated with the Southwark as the Southwark and Vauxhall, the very company you mention, charged considerably less than any other. The return shows that while they obtained only 15 shillings per 1,000 hogshead, the West Middlesex, the highest, exacted 48 shillings and sixpence for the same quantity. Consequently, had the houses of the foolish landlord who refused 1/2 penny per week for water stood in northwestern instead of southern London, he would have had to pay more than treble, or a fraction above 3d. per week. Allowing for difference of level, I remarked, and other interferences with the cheap delivery of water, the disparity in the charges of the different companies, and even by the same company to different customers, is unaccountable. They are guided by no principle. You have mentioned the extreme points of the scale of rates, and remaining companies charged at the time you mention, respectively per 1,000 hogsheads, 17 shillings, 17 shillings and twopence, 21 shillings, 28 shillings, 29 shillings, and 45 shillings. The only companies whose charges are limited by Act of Parliament are the Grand Junction, the East London, the Southwark and Vauxhall, and the Lambeth. The others exact precisely what they please." "And," interposed Littleton, "there is no redress. The only appeal we, the taxed, have is to our taxes, and the monopoly is so tight that, as in my case, although your next-door neighbour is supplied from a cheaper company, you are not allowed to change." "The companies were obliged to combine to save themselves from ruin and the public from extreme inconvenience," said our informant. During the competition streets were torn up, traffic was stopped, and confusion was worse confounded in the districts where the opposition raged." "But what happened when the war ceased and the general peace was concluded?" said Littleton, chuckling. "To show how ill some of the companies managed their affairs, I could cite some laughable cases. When the combination commenced, some of them forgot to stop off their mains, and supplied water to customers whom they had previously turned over to their quondam rivals, so that one company gave the water and the other pocketed the rent. This, in some instances, went on for years." Here the subject branched off into other topics. It is worthy of notice that the conversation was carried on by the side of the enormous Cornish engine, that was driving 4,400 gallons per minute, 218 feet high. "It is marvellous," I remarked, "that so much power can be exercised with so little noise and vibration." "That's owing to the patent valves in the pump," said the stoker. Taking a last look at the monster, we went outside to view the standpipe. Being, as we were told, 218 feet high, it tops the monument in Fish Street Hill by 16 feet. Within it is performed the last stroke of hydraulic art which is needed, for nature does the rest. The water, sent up through the middle or thickest of the tubes, falls over into the open mouths of the smaller ones, which most people mistake for supports, descends through all four at once into the conduit pipe, and travels of its own accord leisurely to London. In obedience to the law of levels, it rises without further trouble to the tops of the tallest houses, on the highest spots of the company's district. In its way it fills a large reservoir on Camden Hill. The iron conduit pipe ends at Poland Street, Oxford Street, and is 7½ miles long. Our inspection was now terminated. We took a parting glass of water with our intelligent and communicative hosts, and returned to town. I firmly believe that the success of Littleton's speech at the great meeting next day was very much owing to this visit. The room was crowded in every part. His tone was moderate. He avoided the extravagant exaggerations of the more fiery order of water-spouters. Neither was he too tame. He was not, as More said of a Tory orator, like an awkward thing of wood, which up and down its clumsy arm doth move, and only spout and spout and spout away in one weak washy everlasting flood. But he came out capitally in the hard argumentative style. His oration bristled with logic and statistics to a degree of which I cannot pretend to give the faintest notion. Sipping inspiration out of a tumbler filled with the flowing subject of discussion, Mr. Littleton commenced by declaring his conviction that the water supply to the metropolis was, generally speaking, bad in quality, extravagantly dear, and, from excessive waste, deficient in quantity. In order to remedy those defects, an efficient control was essential. Continuous supply, filtration, and a uniform scale of rates must be enforced. Some of the companies were pocketing enormous dividends, and was it a fair argument to retort that they are now being reimbursed for periods of no dividend at all? Are we of the present day be mulcted to cover losses occasioned because the early career of some of these companies was marked by the ignorance, imprudence, and reckless extravagance which he, Mr. Littleton, could prove it was? If our wine merchant, or coal merchant, or baker began business badly and with loss, would he be tolerated if, when he grew wiser and more prosperous, he tried to exact large prices to cover the consequences of his previous mismanagement? Mr. Littleton apprehended not. With this branch of the question he proceeded to remark, the important subjects of distribution and supply were intimately connected. It had been ascertained that a vast proportion of the poor had no water in their houses. Why? Partly because it was too dear, but partly he, the learned speaker, was bound to say from the parsimony of landlords, he had pointed out a remedy for the first evil. For the second, he would propose that every house owner should be bound to introduce pipes into every house. The law was stringent on him as to sewers and party walls, and why should not a water supply be enforced on him also? In dealing with the whole question of supply, the honourable gentleman went on to say he could not agree with those who stated that the delivery of it was deficient. A moderate calculation estimated the quantity running through the underground network of London pipes 56 million of gallons per day. Waste, of which there is a prodigious amount, steam engines, cattle, public baths, and other supplies deducted, left more than 10 gallons per diem per head for the whole population. That is supposing these gallons were equitably distributed, but they are not. The rich get an excess, and the poor get none at all. He, the learned barrister, was not prepared to say that 10 or 20 gallons per head daily were sufficient for all the purposes of life in this or in any other city, great or small, but this he would say, that under proper management the existing supply might be made ample for present wants. Whether for the requirements of augmenting population and increased cleanliness, we need not discuss now. What was wanted at this time was a better distribution rather than a greater supply, but what he wanted most of all was united action and one governing body. Without this, confusion, extravagance, and waste would inevitably continue. Mr. Littleton wound up with a peroration that elicited very general applause. Although we must, he said, establish an efficient control over the existing means of water supply, we must neither wholly despise nor neglect them, nor blindly rush into new and ruinous schemes. We must remove the onus of payment from the poorer tenants to their landlords, and into whatever central directing power the waterworks of this great city shall pass, concluded the learned orator with energetic unction. Our motto must be continuous supply, uniform rates, and universal filtration. End of section 2. 19.2